Hello friends, settle in, because tonight we're stepping into a Tudor palace in England, somewhere in the final decade of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, into everything it actually took to turn one tired, aging woman into the most carefully guarded image in Europe, one single morning at a time. A face painted white with a mixture that, in all likelihood, contained actual lead, applied fresh most mornings for years on end, days, sometimes several in a row, that could pass without what we would call a proper bath, cloths and basins and perfume standing in for the plunge into water most of us take for granted. A queen, wrapped in pearls and gold thread worth more than most of her own subjects would see across an entire lifetime, who still could not use her own chamber pot without one particular trusted woman kneeling nearby to attend to it. Tonight holds a great many more of these, folded quietly into the story of one single, very ordinary, very extraordinary day and night in the life of Elizabeth I. If a story like this one has ever helped you drift off, leaving a like and subscribing helps this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you're here, I would genuinely love to know where you're settling in tonight. Maybe a quiet night somewhere in Texas, or a late hour in London with the city finally starting to go still outside your window. Drop it in the comments below. I really do read every single one. Alright, love. Let your hands rest. Let your shoulders drop. Let's begin. Forget the woman in the portraits for a moment. The one with the impossibly white face and the stiff lace collar rising behind her head, like a halo made of starched linen, staring out from museum walls with an expression that never seems to age and never seems to tire. That woman does not exist yet tonight. Not fully, not yet. Not for another 2 hours. Right now, in a chamber inside a Tudor palace on a morning sometime in the 1590s, there is only a woman somewhere in her 60s lying in a curtained bed, awake before her attendants realise it, listening to the particular silence of a room that has not yet been allowed to become the wider world. Her name is Elizabeth, and in a moment several women will enter this room and begin the long, strange work of turning her, piece by particular piece, into a queen. Not metaphorically, literally. Piece by piece, layer by layer, until the tired, aging body lying in this bed, entirely human still, has been replaced, at least to the eyes of everyone outside this room, by something closer to an idea. Something that does not appear to age at all. She has likely gone several mornings without what we would call a full bath, and not because nobody cared about cleanliness. The Tudor understanding of the body made a full immersion something to be approached carefully, almost medically, rather than something to do every day the way we might now. Later this morning, her face will be painted with a mixture that, in all likelihood, contains actual lead. Her teeth, when she smiles, and she does still smile, will show the damage of a lifetime spent loving sugar more than perhaps any monarch before her. Using the chamber vessel tucked discreetly near her bed will require the presence of one particular trusted woman, because even that, even the most private function a body performs, is not something a queen is permitted to do entirely alone. And before she's seen by a single soul outside this room today, several different women will have touched her, dressed her, painted her, and adjusted her, each one a small, quiet gatekeeper standing between the private Elizabeth and the public one. We tend to imagine queens simply existing in their finery, as though they were born wearing it. The truth is messier, slower, and more human than that, and it unfolds in roughly the order it actually happened, on a morning very much like this one, somewhere in the final decade of the reign of Elizabeth I. A single candle is already lit near the window, small and steady, though it is barely needed. Grey early light is starting to find its way through a gap in the heavy curtain, and somewhere beyond the door low voices are already moving, quiet and unhurried. Not loud. Nothing in this particular world is ever loud this early. Just the particular murmur of a household beginning to stir around the one person it exists to serve. There is a particular sound that begins this world every morning, and it is nothing dramatic at all. It is the soft clink of a silver basin being set down on a low table near the bed, followed by the quiet slosh of warm water being poured from a ewer that has been sitting near the fire since before dawn to take the chill off it. Elizabeth sits up against a bank of bolsters, and the first hands to touch her today belong to one of her most senior gentlewomen, a woman she has known and trusted for years. because there is no version of this morning where a stranger is permitted anywhere near the Queen's body. A full bath was not a daily event, and it is not that Tudor royalty was indifferent to cleanliness. Quite the opposite, really. Elizabeth was known, even by the standards of her own court, as someone unusually particular about it. What she and her physicians believed was that submerging the whole body in water, especially warm water, opened the pores and left a person dangerously exposed to bad air, to chills, to whatever invisible corruption might be drifting through a draughty stone palace at any given hour. A full immersed bath was something planned, prepared for, sometimes even mildly feared, not something reached for casually before breakfast. So instead, cleanliness happens differently this morning, the way it happens most mornings. A soft linen cloth, dipped in the warm, scented water, moves gently over her face, her throat, beneath her arms, along her hands. The water itself is not plain. It has likely been infused overnight with rosemary, or rose petals, or sweet herbs gathered from the palace gardens specifically for this purpose, so that what touches her skin carries fragrance along with it. Fresh linen follows immediately after, a clean shift replacing whatever she slept in, because if there is one form of cleanliness the Tudor mind trusted completely, without hesitation, without theory, it was this one. Clean linen against the skin, changed often, was considered nearly as important as washing itself, sometimes more so. The logic made a strange kind of sense within their world. Linen absorbed the body's impurities and could simply be replaced, laundered, replaced again, in a way that skin itself could not. An entire system of hygiene, in other words, built not around scrubbing the body raw, but around surrounding it, again and again, with something soft and clean and freshly changed. It was not the version of cleanliness we practice now. It was not neglect either, whatever the popular image of unwashed Tudor royalty might suggest. There is another piece of this early routine that tells you something real about what royal privacy actually meant, or rather, did not mean, in this world. Somewhere near the bed, discreetly positioned, screened by a folding panel of carved wood or heavy fabric, sits what the household calls the close stool. A padded seat, often upholstered in velvet, set over a removable pewter or pewter-lined container, sometimes carried from residence to residence, along with the rest of the Queen's most personal furnishings whenever the court moved. Even something as private as this could not simply happen alone. One particular woman, a position of genuine trust within the household, holds responsibility for this vessel and this moment, every single day, without exception. No hour of Elizabeth's day, arguably no hour of her entire adult life as Queen, ever truly offered the kind of solitude most of us simply take for granted. Even here, of all places. Especially here, in a strange way, because the woman entrusted with this particular task occupied a position of real intimacy and real power within the household, precisely because she alone witnessed the Queen at her most unguarded. Privacy, as we understand that word today, essentially did not exist for a Tudor monarch. Not in the bath, not on the close stool, not even fully asleep. We tend to imagine royalty as the ultimate form of freedom, doing whatever one likes, whenever one likes. The reality, at least for someone in Elizabeth's position, ran almost entirely the opposite direction. The higher the rank, the less privacy remained. By the time a person reaches a reigning queen, there is functionally none left at all. The vessel is emptied quietly, discreetly, by staff further down the household hierarchy, who will never be seen by Elizabeth herself, layers upon layers of people managing a single ordinary bodily function, so that not one unpleasant detail ever needs to reach the Queen's own awareness. A kind of luxury, in its own quiet way, not privacy exactly, insulation. Washing, linen, and the quiet business near the bed all happen within perhaps 20 minutes, and then the true work of the morning begins in earnest. Elizabeth moves to a low chair near the window, where the light is best, and a small table is drawn close, covered with pots and jars and brushes that would look, at a glance, almost like something from a modern dressing table, if you did not know what several of them actually contained. A white paste, worked gently into her face, her throat, and the backs of her hands, is very likely a preparation known to history as ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. It produced the pale, flawless finish, almost porcelain in its smoothness, that Elizabeth and her court considered the height of beauty, a visible sign of a life spent indoors, away from labour, away from sun, the complexion of someone who did not need to work with her hands or her face outdoors a single day of her life. Repeated exposure to lead of this particular kind, applied close against the skin over years, carried real and serious risks that Tudor medicine did not yet understand, among them headaches, hair loss, and damage to the very skin the paint was meant to protect. Nobody at court could have named those particular risks with any real precision. The connection between lead and the harm it caused would not be properly understood for centuries, and there is no way to know exactly how much of what Elizabeth experienced in later life, if anything, this particular substance was responsible for. What can be said with confidence is that a great many fashionable women of her era used preparations very much like it, regularly and for years, entirely unaware of what that regular use might quietly be costing them, layer after layer, season after season. Here is the quiet contradiction underneath it. The very thing being used to project health, youth, and untouchable royal perfection may have been working against all three. By the later years of her reign, the years we are inside tonight, some accounts suggest the paint had grown thicker still, applied in heavier layers, in part to smooth skin that smallpox had scarred decades earlier, in her 20s, and in part simply to maintain, however artificially, the illusion of a face untouched by time. A touch of red follows, applied carefully to the lips and lightly to the cheeks, likely made from ground cochineal insects, or occasionally something as sharp and genuinely dangerous as vermilion, a compound of mercury, red for the mouth, white for everything else. That was essentially the entire visible logic of late Tudor royal beauty, a stark, almost mask-like contrast that read clearly even from across a crowded great hall, even by candlelight, even to someone who might only glimpse the Queen's face for a single moment as she passed, close enough perhaps to catch the faint sweetness of the perfume worked into the paint itself, but never close enough to see the aging skin resting quietly underneath it. While the paint is still settling, another woman begins working at Elizabeth's hair, and this is where the morning takes a turn that surprises almost everyone who hears about it for the first time. By this point in her reign, in her 60s, Elizabeth's own hair, the famous red hair she was known for throughout her younger years, has thinned considerably, the way hair often does with age, and very possibly the way it thinned further from decades of the very lead-based cosmetics we just discussed sitting against her scalp and hairline. What the world sees, though, what appears at court in an hour or two, is nothing thin at all. It is full, richly red, elaborately curled and pinned, because Elizabeth wore wigs, and wore them without any particular secrecy about it, at least not among the women who dressed her. A hairpiece is brought forward now, mounted on a wooden or wire frame, dressed in curls arranged the night before by a woman whose entire specialty within the household is hair. It is pinned carefully into place over Elizabeth's own remaining hair, secured with wire, with pins, sometimes woven through with pearls or fine gold thread depending on what the day ahead requires. Her own hairline, meanwhile, has likely been plucked further back over the years, a fashion that had been in vogue since her youth, when a high, broad forehead was considered a mark of beauty and breeding. Pluck the hairline back, cover the thinning remainder with something fuller and more perfect, layer artifice over nature, until the two become almost impossible to separate from the outside. I keep coming back to this idea tonight, the sheer amount of construction involved in what the rest of the world would simply experience as Elizabeth's appearance. Nothing about the face and hair that would greet the court in an hour is strictly speaking unaltered, and yet none of it was considered dishonest, or vain, or strange, not within this world. It was simply what royal presentation required. The private, aging woman sitting in this chair, entirely mortal beneath it all, was never meant to be the version anyone outside this room encountered. That version stayed here, behind these walls, known only to the small handful of women trusted enough to see her. Dressing itself begins properly now, and it is worth understanding that this is not a 5-minute affair. This is closer to an hour, sometimes more, involving several women working in careful, practiced coordination, each responsible for a different layer, a different fastening, a different part of the whole. It starts simply enough. A fresh linen smock, soft against skin that has just been washed and dried, followed by stockings of silk or fine wool, gartered just above or below the knee depending on the fashion of the moment. Then comes the first true structural layer, a boned bodice, sometimes called a pair of bodies, stiffened with strips of whalebone or wood, laced snugly up the back or the sides by 2 women working in tandem, one holding the fabric steady while the other draws the laces tight. This is not comfortable. I want to be honest about that rather than romanticize it away. It compresses the torso, straightens the posture, and Elizabeth will wear this, along with everything layered above it, for most of the next 12 or more hours, through meals, through audiences, through whatever the day requires of her. Over this comes the farthingale, a hooped underskirt, likely by this point in her reign a French-style farthingale, which creates that dramatic drum-shaped silhouette you have probably seen in her later portraits, the skirt extending outward from the waist in a wide, rigid circle before falling straight to the floor. It is constructed from a series of graduated hoops, whalebone or reed, sewn into channels of fabric, and it adds considerable weight before a single outer layer has even been put on. Petticoats follow next, layered over the farthingale to soften its hard architectural edges and give the finished skirt its proper fullness and drape. I find myself genuinely admiring the engineering involved here, honestly. This is not simply clothing, it is closer to a constructed garment architecture, each piece solving a problem the previous piece created, each layer adding both beauty and considerable physical burden in roughly equal measure. Now the gown itself, and this is where the room genuinely starts to feel like a small workshop rather than a bedchamber. Elizabeth's wardrobe by this stage of her reign runs into the hundreds of gowns, maintained by a dedicated department of the royal household known as the Office of the Robes, and this morning's choice has already been decided the previous evening, laid out and inspected for any loose thread, any mark, any imperfection, before it is ever brought near the Queen herself. The gown goes on in pieces, not as a single garment the way we might picture a modern dress. A stiffened stomacher first, a triangular panel that fits snugly over the front of the bodice, often heavily embroidered, sometimes sewn directly with pearls or small jewels, then the skirt, wide and stiff over the farthingale beneath it, followed by a bodice matching the skirt, and then separately, sleeves, which in this period were frequently detachable, pinned or laced onto the bodice fresh for each occasion, allowing a single gown skirt and bodice to be paired with different sleeves for different days, a small practicality hiding inside all this extraordinary formality. And then, finally, the ruff. I imagine you already pictured this the moment I mentioned her, that wide, stiff collar radiating outward, pleated linen or lace framing her face like a plate balanced on end. By the 1590s, ruffs at the English court had grown genuinely enormous, some extending nearly a foot from the neck in every direction, held rigid with a starch mixture, sometimes further supported by a wire frame called a supportass hidden beneath it. Putting one on required real skill, the fabric pleated by hand into hundreds of tiny even folds, then carefully pinned into place around Elizabeth's throat, high enough to nearly reach her ears. Here is a detail that always makes me smile a little, because it is so quietly practical, hiding inside so much extravagance. A ruff this size made it genuinely difficult to eat without care, to turn the head quickly, to do very much at all except sit, stand, and be looked at with tremendous dignity, which was, in a strange way, rather close to the entire point. Jewellery comes last, and it comes in genuinely staggering quantity. Ropes of pearls, which Elizabeth favoured above almost any other gem, are looped around her neck, sewn onto her bodice, woven through the wig itself, rings on nearly every finger, a jewelled pendant, perhaps a brooch shaped like a phoenix or an ermine, symbols she used deliberately, purposefully, small pieces of political messaging worn quite literally on her body, Pearls, in particular, carried meaning here beyond simple decoration. They were associated with purity, with the moon, with an untouched, unmarried state, and Elizabeth wore them constantly, consistently for decades, reinforcing an image she cultivated with real deliberate care. Perfumed gloves go on next, scented with civet or ambergris or orange flower water, both a fashion statement and a practical one, since strongly scented leather helped mask whatever less pleasant smell the tanning process itself might have left behind. A small pomander, a scented ball carried or worn at the waist, joins the gloves, filled with a mixture of musk, herbs and spices meant to ward off bad air, which Tudor medicine still believed carried disease. Between the pomander, the perfumed gloves, and whatever floral water had been used earlier during the washing, Elizabeth by this point smells, quite deliberately, like an entire garden concentrated into a single small moving point. And here, finally, nearly 2 hours after she first sat up in bed, the transformation is complete. The tired woman in her 60s who woke alone in a curtained bed has become, layer by layer, decision by decision, something closer to a symbol than a person, ready to step through a set of doors and become, for the rest of the day, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. A face that does not appear to age, framed in white lace and red gold hair, moving with a straight-backed dignity that several hours of tightly laced boning does more than a little to enforce. I find that transition genuinely moving, honestly, watching it laid out step by step like this. Not because it is sad exactly, though there is something in it worth sitting with, but because it reveals just how much deliberate, exhausting work sat underneath an image the rest of the world experienced as effortless. The doors open, and this is a genuine moment, staged as carefully as everything else this morning has been. Beyond the privy chamber wait more attendants, ladies of slightly lower rank than the women who dressed her, along with perhaps a guard or two stationed at a respectful distance. Elizabeth steps through, and something visibly shifts in the room the instant she does. Conversations quiet, bodies incline into small, practiced bows and curtsies. The Queen has entered, and for everyone present, the entirely human woman who woke tired an hour and a half ago has simply ceased to exist, replaced completely by the version everyone in this palace has spent their whole career learning how to read. That is not an exaggeration, by the way. The idea of learning to read her. Courtiers genuinely studied Elizabeth's face, her posture, the particular tone of her voice, the way she held her hands, searching constantly for small signs of favour or displeasure, because so much of political life at this court depended on catching those signals early. A slight smile might mean a request would be granted. A cool glance held a beat too long might mean a courtier's entire fortune was about to change for the worse. She understood this completely, and by this stage of her reign, after decades of practice, she deployed her own expressions and silences with real, deliberate skill, an actress performing to an audience that never stopped watching, not for one single moment of the day. But we are getting a little ahead of ourselves, and there is more from this morning worth returning to before we follow her fully into the business of the court. Let us go back for a moment to something I promised you at the very start of tonight's story: her teeth. Elizabeth loved sugar, genuinely, enthusiastically loved it, at a time when sugar itself was a rare and expensive imported luxury, not the ordinary household staple it would later become. Sugar appeared at her table constantly, worked into elaborate sculpted subtleties shaped like castles or animals for grand occasions, dissolved into wine, folded into pastries, preserved into fruit, and she ate it, by most accounts, with real and lasting enthusiasm across her entire life. A German visitor to her court, some years before the morning we are inside tonight, wrote afterward that her teeth had gone visibly black, a detail that travelled widely enough at the time that it has survived clearly in the historical record all the way to us tonight. Tudor dentistry, meanwhile, offered very little in the way of genuine remedy. Tooth powders made from ground substances that ranged from the reasonably gentle to the genuinely abrasive, cloths for rubbing the teeth clean, and beyond that, essentially nothing except extraction when pain became unbearable, performed without anaesthetic beyond perhaps strong drink or certain herbs believed to dull sensation. There is a story, and I want to be careful here, because this one lives more in the territory of court anecdote than confirmed fact, That when Elizabeth suffered from a badly aching tooth later in her reign and resisted having it pulled, terrified of the procedure despite the pain, the Bishop of London offered to have one of his own healthy teeth extracted first, right there in front of her, simply to demonstrate that the pain was bearable and prove there was nothing to fear. Whether that particular story unfolded exactly as later accounts describe it, the underlying reality it points toward is entirely real. Dental pain in this era was something people endured for as long as humanly possible, because the alternative offered very little comfort of its own. This morning, before we ever reached the cosmetics or the gown, her women will have cleaned her teeth as best this era allowed, likely with a cloth and a mildly abrasive powder, a small quiet ritual squeezed in among the washing, doing what little could be done for a mouth that decades of genuine sweetness had already marked rather permanently. Breakfast, when it comes, is a smaller and more private affair than the grand ceremonial dinners the court is famous for. But even here, even eating something as simple as bread and small beer, or perhaps a little meat, the entire event carries a weight of ceremony that would feel almost absurd to a modern eye. Before anything reaches Elizabeth's table, it passes through a careful chain of testing and handling designed around one persistent, entirely reasonable fear: poison. A yeoman of the pantry, or a similarly trusted officer of the household, oversees the delivery of each dish, and specific items are tasted beforehand by designated staff, a practice with real teeth to it, not merely ceremonial theatre, in a court that had lived through genuine assassination plots and genuine religious and political tension for the entirety of Elizabeth's reign. Linen napkins are presented for ceremonial hand-washing before she eats, water poured over her fingers from a jug into a basin held by an attendant kneeling before her, an old and formalized courtesy that had by this point less to do with practical cleanliness and everything to do with visible ritual, the performance of respect made physical. The food itself, when we look past the ceremony surrounding it, tells its own story. Elizabeth's later reign is remembered for a court cuisine, leaning heavily toward the sweet and the rich, marchpane, a dense almond and sugar paste, often shaped and gilded for banquets, preserved fruits suspended in sugar syrup, spiced wine, elaborate pastries. Meat featured heavily too, of course, roasted and boiled and spiced in the manner of the age, but it is the sugar that tends to surprise people most, appearing everywhere, in dishes that a modern palate would not necessarily expect it, folded even into savoury preparations, because sweetness itself carried a kind of prestige, a visible signal of wealth that few households outside the nobility could ever hope to afford in any real quantity. I think what strikes me most about this particular ritual, the tasting, the hand-washing, the ceremonial presentation of even the simplest breakfast, is how thoroughly it turns an ordinary human need into a kind of small daily theatre. Eating breakfast should be, by any reasonable measure, one of the least remarkable acts of a person's entire day. Here it is anything but. Later in the morning, after breakfast has been cleared away, one of Elizabeth's physicians is admitted briefly to the privy chamber, and this is worth pausing on, because Tudor medicine operated on principles almost entirely foreign to how we think about the body today. The dominant framework, inherited from ancient sources and still very much alive in the 1590s, held that the body was governed by four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that health depended on keeping these four substances in proper balance. Illness, in this understanding, was rarely a matter of infection or injury in the way we would describe it now. It was an imbalance, too much of one humour, too little of another, and treatment aimed to correct that imbalance directly. This particular morning, the physician's visit is fairly routine, more consultation than treatment, a few questions about her sleep, her appetite, whether any particular discomfort has troubled her. But it is worth understanding what a more involved appointment might have looked like on a different day, because the methods themselves tell you so much about how differently this era understood the body. A physician might examine a sample of urine held up to the light, checking its colour, its clarity, even at times its smell, searching for clues about the internal balance of humours it was believed to reflect. Bloodletting remained a standard treatment for a wide range of complaints, a vein opened carefully, a measured amount of blood drawn off, on the theory that this relieved an excess believed to be causing fever or pain or agitation. Purging and sweating treatments, herbal preparations designed to induce one or the other, served similar corrective purposes, along with careful dietary adjustments, certain foods avoided, others prescribed, depending on which humour a physician believed needed rebalancing. Elizabeth, by most accounts, held a fairly cautious, occasionally openly sceptical relationship with her own physicians throughout much of her reign. She trusted certain individuals considerably, relied on them for real ongoing care, and yet she is recorded more than once resisting a recommended treatment she found unappealing or simply chose not to believe in, the tooth extraction we discussed earlier being perhaps the clearest example. There is something almost recognizable in that. Honestly, a patient with her own strong opinions about her own body, even within a medical system built almost entirely around expert authority. I find that oddly comforting, actually, the idea that even a queen occasionally simply said no. There is something else occupying the household this particular morning, something that has been quietly shaping decisions since the previous evening. A foreign ambassador is expected at court today, a formal audience arranged weeks in advance. The kind of appearance where every visible detail, the gown, the jewels, the composure of her face, carries genuine diplomatic weight. Kingdoms and courts across Europe study these audiences closely, reading Elizabeth's appearance and bearing for signs of the kingdom's strength, her own health, her continued vigour as a ruler well into her 60s, at a time when questions about succession hang, unspoken but constant, over nearly everything the English court does. This is precisely why this particular morning's preparation matters more than most, and why I wanted you to see the ordinary version first before we return to a day with something specific riding on it. Every layer we walked through earlier, the paint, the wig, the ruff, the pearls, none of it is vanity in the simple sense. It is armour, and today it is armour being prepared for a specific watching audience. Somewhere in the middle of the dressing we described earlier, a small complication had in fact occurred, one of those tiny domestic problems the finished performance never lets anyone outside this room see. The ruff intended for today's audience, freshly starched and pleated the evening before, had softened slightly overnight in the damp palace air, its careful folds beginning to droop rather than hold their crisp radiating shape. The woman responsible noticed it immediately upon unwrapping it this morning, and rather than risk Elizabeth appearing before a foreign ambassador in anything less than perfect, a second ruff was sent for at once, along with fresh starch and a heated iron rod called a poking stick, used specifically for pressing the deep, even pleats back into shape. It added perhaps 20 additional minutes to a morning already running long, 20 minutes during which the women dressing her worked with visible quiet urgency, though never once in a way Elizabeth herself seemed troubled by. She had lived through enough of these mornings by now, decades of them, to understand that small crises like this one resolved themselves reliably, so long as the people around her kept their composure and did their work, which they did, as they nearly always did. By mid-morning, the audience proceeds in the presence chamber, a long, richly decorated room hung with tapestries and lit by tall windows, crowded with courtiers arranged carefully by rank along the walls, leaving a clear path down the centre for Elizabeth's approach. She moves through it slowly, deliberately, the wide farthingale forcing a measured, gliding pace that reads, to everyone watching, as dignity rather than the simple mechanical necessity it partly is. The ambassador bows low, formal words are exchanged, translated where necessary, gifts presented, compliments offered about her health, her beauty, her evident continued vigour, compliments that everyone present understands, are at least partly a diplomatic performance in their own right, whatever grain of genuine feeling might sit somewhere underneath them. Elizabeth was, by every account that survives her, remarkably skilled at this particular kind of theatre. She used silence deliberately, letting a pause stretch a beat longer than comfortable before responding. She used her hands, her famously expressive eyes, small shifts of posture, all of it calculated, practiced, honed across decades of exactly this kind of encounter. Ambassadors returning home wrote detailed reports back to their own courts describing her appearance, her manner, her apparent health, reports that shaped how entire foreign governments assessed the stability of the English crown. Every gesture in this room, in other words, was being read as information, whether Elizabeth intended it that way in any given moment or not. And here is something worth noticing quietly, tucked inside all this formal grandeur. The compliments about her beauty, her youthful vigour, arriving as they regularly did even now, in her 60s, were not simply courtesy. They were, in a real sense, part of the ongoing political project of Elizabeth's later reign, the deliberate maintenance of an image that resisted, at least publicly, the plain fact of her ageing. Portraits commissioned during these years increasingly avoided showing her natural signs of age altogether, favouring instead a stylized, almost timeless face, smooth and unwrinkled, regardless of how many years had actually passed since the artist last saw her in person. Some later portraits, art historians have noted, appear to rely more on earlier approved images than on any fresh study of her actual current face. The Queen the public saw, in paint as much as in person this morning, was increasingly a carefully maintained fiction, agreed upon by everyone whose job it was to protect it. There is a particular kind of question that follows Elizabeth into nearly every foreign audience, spoken sometimes directly, more often carefully implied. Marriage. By this stage of her reign, in her 60s, the question has long since stopped being a genuine diplomatic possibility and has settled instead into something closer to ritual, a courtesy still occasionally raised by ambassadors representing this prince or that, more out of formal habit than any real expectation of a different answer than the one she has given consistently for decades. Elizabeth had built, quite deliberately, an entire public identity around her unmarried state, styling herself as married instead to her kingdom, to her people, a choice that early in her reign had been a matter of genuine political calculation, avoiding the complications a foreign or domestic marriage might bring, and that had, over the decades since, hardened into something closer to a defining symbol of her entire reign. The Virgin Queen. Pearls, again, worn constantly, chosen deliberately for their association with purity and the moon and an untouched state. Portraits commissioned, showing her surrounded by symbols, reinforcing the same idea again and again. An ermine here, a sieve there, each one a small, deliberate piece of visual argument about exactly who and what she represented. I find this particular piece of the story genuinely fascinating, the sheer scale of image management involved, centuries before anyone had a word for that concept. Every pearl, every symbol, every carefully composed portrait, every graceful non-answer offered to yet another ambassador's polite inquiry about marriage, functioned as part of a single sustained performance, decades long, remarkably consistent, built and maintained by a woman who understood, perhaps better than almost anyone else in Europe at the time, exactly how much power lived inside a carefully controlled public image. The audience concludes eventually with more formal courtesies, gifts exchanged, the ambassador withdrawing with careful backward steps, never quite turning his back on the Queen until he has passed through the doors. Elizabeth remains a moment longer, exchanging a few quiet words with members of her Privy Council standing nearby, before the business of the morning gives way, gradually, to whatever the rest of the day holds. Hours follow the ambassador's audience now, settling into something closer to ordinary work. Though ordinary is a strange word to use for anything involving the governance of a kingdom, Elizabeth withdraws to a smaller chamber where members of her Privy Council await her, papers already laid out, matters of state requiring her attention, her signature, her judgment. She was, by every account of those who worked closely with her, a genuinely careful and engaged ruler, reading documents closely rather than simply trusting summaries handed to her, asking pointed questions, occasionally revising language herself before allowing a document to proceed. It is easy, sitting here tonight thinking about the paint and the pearls and the elaborate ritual of her mourning, to lose sight of this part entirely, the actual daily labour of ruling a kingdom that, by the 1590s, stretched from ongoing tension with Spain to complicated negotiations across Ireland and Scotland, to the constant delicate management of a court full of ambitious men who each believed, in his own private way, that he understood the kingdom's needs better than the woman currently governing it. Elizabeth managed all of it from behind the same painted face and towering ruff we spent the earlier part of tonight's story constructing, piece by piece, and there is something worth noticing in that combination, the genuine intellectual and political labour happening underneath so much visible ornament. Her secretary reads certain matters aloud. She dictates responses to others, her voice, by multiple accounts, capable of shifting quickly between warmth and real sharpness depending entirely on what the moment required. Council members who arrived expecting an easy audience occasionally left considerably more chastened than they had planned, because whatever her physical vulnerabilities, whatever the elaborate machinery required simply to get her dressed and painted each morning, her political instincts by this stage of her reign remained, by nearly every surviving account, remarkably sharp. This work continues for perhaps 2 hours, broken only by a brief pause during which wine and a light refreshment are brought in, the same careful tasting ritual observed earlier at breakfast repeated quietly, almost invisibly, in the background of a room otherwise occupied with matters of considerably greater apparent weight. Midday brings the more formal, more genuinely theatrical version of dining that the Tudor court was famous for, though even here Elizabeth herself often ate rather sparingly compared to the sheer scale of the ceremony surrounding the meal. Dishes arrive in a long, carefully choreographed procession, carried by household officers walking in formal order, each dish tasted before it reaches the table, each course announced with a small flourish of ceremony that would feel, to modern eyes, almost theatrical in its own right. The food itself tells a story about wealth and rank as much as it does about taste. Roasted meats of every kind, venison, swan on the grandest occasions, elaborate pies constructed as much for visual spectacle as for eating, sugared fruits, spiced wines, and always, somewhere among the courses, something built almost entirely from sugar, a marchpane sculpture perhaps, gilded and shaped into a castle or a coat of arms, meant to be admired nearly as much as consumed. Elizabeth, despite her well-documented love of sweetness, is often described by those who observed her closely as a fairly moderate eater overall, careful about her diet in a way that occasionally puzzled physicians accustomed to court appetites considerably larger than hers. I find something quietly interesting in that particular contrast, honestly, the theatrical, almost overwhelming abundance of the meal itself set against a woman eating rather carefully in the middle of it. Court dining under Elizabeth functioned, in many ways, less as nourishment and more as a kind of ongoing demonstration, wealth and hierarchy and English prosperity made visible, course by course, to whichever ambassadors or nobles happened to be watching that particular day. Whether Elizabeth herself finished even half of what passed before her mattered considerably less than simply having been offered at all, prepared, presented, and witnessed. Music plays quietly throughout. Musicians positioned in a gallery above the hall, their presence carefully arranged to enhance the atmosphere without ever competing with the conversation below. Elizabeth genuinely loved music, played the virginals herself with real skill by most accounts, and the sound drifting down from that gallery this particular afternoon is soft, deliberate, and entirely in keeping with everything else about this meal, beautiful, controlled, and performed for an audience that never fully stops watching. After the meal, Elizabeth typically walked, and this detail matters more than it might first appear. Physicians of the era genuinely believed regular gentle movement essential to maintaining the balance of the humours we discussed earlier, and Elizabeth, whatever her occasional skepticism toward more invasive treatments, took this particular piece of medical advice seriously and consistently across her entire life. On a fair afternoon, she walks through one of the palace's formal gardens, accompanied by a small retinue of ladies and, at a respectful distance, guards who never fully leave her alone even here, among clipped hedges and gravel paths. The garden itself is a carefully ordered thing, geometric beds of herbs and flowers laid out in patterns meant to be admired from the windows above as much as walked through at ground level, fountains here and there, a few covered walkways offering shelter if the weather turns. Even here, in what looks from a distance like simple leisure, there is structure, intention, a kind of controlled beauty that mirrors almost everything else about how this world is organized. Walking, for Elizabeth, in that heavy boned gown with its wide skirt, the one we spent so much of tonight constructing, is itself a considerable physical undertaking, the farthingale swaying with each step, the weight of pearls and embroidery pulling steadily at her shoulders, and yet by every account she moved through it with real practiced grace, decades of exactly this kind of walking having long since become second nature. In her younger years, this same love of movement extended considerably further into vigorous dancing that reportedly left partners half her age genuinely struggling to keep pace, and into hunting, which she pursued with real enthusiasm well into her middle years, riding out with hawks or joining hunts on horseback dressed, even then, in clothing considerably more elaborate than practicality alone would ever have required. By the particular afternoon we are inside tonight, in her 60s, the hunting has grown rarer, though not entirely absent, and the dancing, while less frequent than in her youth, has by no means disappeared altogether. She still danced on occasion, at court entertainments, with real evident pleasure, a reminder that whatever the elaborate armour of her public presentation, some genuine private enjoyment persisted underneath it, stubbornly for her entire life. Prayer occupies its own regular place within the rhythm of this day, as it did within nearly every day of Elizabeth's reign. She attends chapel with some regularity, a private space within the palace set aside for exactly this purpose, and her own religious practice, shaped by the particular Protestant settlement she herself had worked carefully to establish and maintain across the early decades of her reign, tends toward a measured, dignified formality rather than anything showy or excessive. A short service, familiar prayers, the quiet murmur of her chaplain's voice in a room lit by candles even during daylight hours, the windows here deliberately smaller, the space more contained and private than the grand public rooms we have spent most of tonight moving through. I mention this not because it is the most dramatic part of her day, because it plainly is not, but because it offers a genuinely different register of her presence, quieter, more interior, a version of Elizabeth considerably closer to the tired, private woman who woke alone in her curtained bed this morning than to Gloriana receiving a foreign ambassador in the presence chamber. Even here, though, she is not truly alone. A handful of attendants remain nearby, at a respectful distance, because true solitude, as we discussed earlier tonight, essentially does not exist anywhere in this queen's life, in any room, at any hour. As afternoon shifts toward evening, the household's attention turns toward whatever entertainment the evening holds, and on many nights during this period of her reign, that meant music, occasionally a play performed by one of the professional companies operating under royal or noble patronage during these years, William Shakespeare's own company among the possibilities by this point in the 1590s, though whether a specific performance happened on this particular evening is something we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that evenings at Elizabeth's court regularly included exactly this kind of entertainment, performers brought in, a hall arranged with seating according to careful rank, candles multiplied by the dozen to light a space that would otherwise fall into near total darkness once the sun went down. Dancing sometimes followed a play, or replaced it entirely on nights when no performance had been arranged, musicians striking up something lively enough to fill the hall with movement and colour, courtiers pairing off in the careful, formal steps of dances that required real skill and real practice to perform well in front of a queen who, whatever her age, still noticed considerably more than most of the dancers likely hoped she would. While all of this unfolds in the grand public rooms of the palace, an entirely different world continues working steadily somewhere beneath and behind it, largely unseen by anyone at that evening's entertainment. Laundresses handle the endless volume of linen this household consumes, smocks and shifts and ruffs and sheets, washed in great vats, starched, dried, pressed and readied again for tomorrow's version of exactly the same elaborate process we walked through this morning. A Tudor palace of this size housed hundreds of people at any given time, and keeping that many bodies clothed, fed and reasonably clean required a genuinely enormous, largely invisible labour force operating on a schedule that had almost nothing to do with the Queen's own hours. Palace sanitation, if we are being honest about it, remained a persistent and genuinely difficult problem throughout this entire period. Rushes covering stone floors in less formal areas of the palace were changed periodically, but not always as often as anyone would have liked, and could harbour fleas, insects and general grime between changes. Herbs and sweet-smelling plants were strewn deliberately among the rushes and scattered through rooms specifically to mask less pleasant smells, a kind of continuous low-level effort against the reality of housing so many people, so many fires, so much cooking, so many animals passing through the grounds, within a set of stone walls that trapped both warmth and odour in roughly equal measure. Damp remained a near-constant companion in the older parts of many Tudor palaces, seeping into tapestries and bedding, encouraging exactly the kind of insect life nobody particularly wanted discussed openly at court, though it existed nonetheless, an ordinary background fact of palace life that even royal privilege could not entirely eliminate. Elizabeth's own chambers received considerably more careful, more frequent attention than most of the palace. Fresh rushes, fresh herbs, linens changed with real regularity, precisely because the small circle of women responsible for her comfort understood that even the smallest lapse here carried consequences considerably more serious than it would have carried almost anywhere else in the building. And yet even her most private rooms existed within the same essential physical world as everywhere else, stone and timber and smoke and damp. A queen's comfort built carefully on top of conditions that no amount of pearls or perfume could ever fully transcend. The restricted circle around Elizabeth deserves a moment of its own attention here, because it shaped nearly everything about her daily life in ways we have already touched on without naming directly. A remarkably small number of people were ever permitted to actually touch the Queen, to dress her, to see her without the paint and the wig, to witness the ordinary human body underneath decades of carefully constructed royal image. These were almost entirely women of the Privy Chamber, gentlewomen and ladies drawn from families she trusted deeply, some of whom had served her for decades, positions that carried genuine intimacy and, alongside it, genuine political weight, since access to the Queen's actual private hours meant access few ambassadors or councillors could ever hope to match. This restriction ran in more than one direction. It protected Elizabeth, no question, kept her genuinely vulnerable moments away from a court that studied her constantly for any sign of weakness or decline, but it also isolated her in a way worth sitting with honestly. The number of people she could simply be herself around, without performance, without calculation, without the constant awareness of being watched and read and interpreted, had narrowed considerably by this stage of her reign, decades into a life lived almost entirely in public, or under the close, careful supervision of the small private staff who managed everything the public was never permitted to see. I think about that sometimes, the particular loneliness that might live inside a life this thoroughly witnessed, surrounded, almost without exception, every hour of every day by other people, and yet genuinely alone in a way most of us rarely experience, because so very few of those people ever encountered anything except a performance. Whatever private grief, private worry, private tiredness Elizabeth carried through these years, the years of watching her closest advisors age and die around her, the years of an increasingly uncertain succession weighing constantly on the kingdom's future, she carried largely behind the same painted, composed face that greeted ambassadors and courtiers alike, day after day, for decades on end. Let me pull back from her body and her clothing for a moment, because I do not want tonight's story to leave you with the impression that Elizabeth was simply a woman constructed entirely of paint and pearls and elaborate performance, however much time we have spent, quite deliberately, inside exactly that construction. There was a formidable mind underneath all of it, and it showed itself constantly in ways that even her harshest critics at the time struggled to dismiss. She had been educated from childhood with real rigour, tutored in Latin, Greek, French and Italian by scholars of genuine reputation, and she maintained fluency in several of these languages throughout her entire life, capable of addressing foreign ambassadors directly in their own tongue when the moment called for it, a skill that occasionally caught visiting diplomats visibly off guard. She translated classical texts herself, for her own pleasure and occasionally for presentation as gifts, careful, considered work that reveals a genuine scholarly seriousness beneath the political theatre. Her handwriting, in surviving letters, shifts noticeably depending on her mood and urgency, a small, human detail that always strikes me when I encounter it. Evidence of an actual person pressing a quill into paper late at night, frustrated or tired or genuinely delighted, rather than the flattened, symbolic queen of the portraits. Council members who worked closely with her across the decades of her reign describe someone who read documents with real care, who asked sharp, occasionally uncomfortable questions, who understood the mechanics of statecraft with a depth that surprised advisors expecting, at least early in her reign, to manage a young and inexperienced queen rather more easily than they in fact found themselves able to. That expectation that she might be easily guided or overruled dissolved fairly quickly for nearly everyone who worked with her at length. By the years we are inside tonight, decades into her reign, nobody at court held any illusions about who actually made the final decisions, however carefully those decisions might be dressed up afterward in the language of counsel and consensus. I find this side of her genuinely admiring to sit with. Honestly, this quiet, persistent intelligence operating underneath everything else we have discussed tonight, the wig and the surus and the pearls doing their considerable work on the surface, while a formidably sharp mind kept its own separate, careful watch over everything that actually mattered. Security threaded through nearly every hour of Elizabeth's day in ways that rarely announced themselves loudly, but were nonetheless constant, and it is worth understanding why, because it explains so much of the careful restriction we discussed a little earlier. Across the decades of her reign, several genuine plots against her life had been uncovered, planned, in some cases, in real and frightening detail, tied to the tangled religious and political tensions of an era where her own Protestant rule remained, to some, a genuine grievance worth acting on. The names of these plots survive clearly in the historical record, conspiracies uncovered through careful intelligence work, conspirators tried and executed, the machinery of the state responding with real and visible severity whenever a credible threat emerged. The result, by the 1590s, was a court where the Queen's physical safety had become an entire ongoing operation, guards stationed at every meaningful threshold, food and drink tasted before ever reaching her table, her most private chambers accessible only to a small, carefully vetted circle, every stranger admitted to any audience or entertainment noted, watched, accounted for. None of this appeared dramatic on an ordinary day like the one we have spent tonight walking through. It simply existed as background structure, invisible unless you knew to look for it, the same way the tasting ritual at breakfast looked, to an untrained eye, like nothing more than polite ceremony. I think this detail deserves a moment of real acknowledgement, because it reframes something we touched on earlier tonight, the lack of privacy surrounding Elizabeth. The constant presence of attendants, even in her most intimate moments, was not simply a strange quirk of royal custom for its own sake. It was, in real and significant part, a genuine security apparatus, built and maintained across decades in response to real and demonstrated threats. Isolation would have made her considerably more vulnerable. The crowded, watchful, carefully managed life she led instead, however strange it might look from where we sit tonight, kept her alive through a reign considerably longer and more turbulent than almost anyone at its beginning might reasonably have predicted. Supper arrives lighter than the midday meal, but no less carefully staged, served perhaps in a smaller chamber if the evening's entertainment has not yet begun, or brought directly into the hall if music and dancing are already underway. Candles multiply as daylight fades, dozens of them eventually, set in silver holders along the walls and suspended from iron chandeliers overhead, their light catching constantly on jewels, on gold thread woven through gowns, on the polished surfaces of silver plate arranged along a side table specifically to be admired, wealth displayed as much as wealth used. The smell of this evening room is its own particular thing, worth pausing on for a moment. Beeswax candles burning steadily, their scent faintly honeyed and warm. Wood smoke drifting from the great fireplace at one end of the hall, mingling with the perfume worn by dozens of courtiers, musk and civet and orange flower water layered one over another until the air itself carries a kind of collective, slightly overwhelming richness. Beneath all of that, faint and constant, the smell of food still warm from the kitchens, roasted meat and spiced wine, and somewhere underneath everything else, the particular mineral coolness of stone walls that no amount of fire or candlelight ever fully banishes from a room this size. Elizabeth typically ate even less at supper than at the midday meal. a habit her physicians occasionally worried over and occasionally praised, depending on which particular medical theory happened to be fashionable among them that season. She preferred, by several accounts, simpler fare in the evening, and often seemed considerably more interested in the conversation and the music filling the hall than in the food itself. She would speak with courtiers seated nearby, exchange a few words with an ambassador if one remained from the earlier audience, occasionally call a favoured musician forward to play something specific, a request that functioned, as so much in this world did, as both genuine personal pleasure and a small, visible act of royal favour bestowed publicly for the entire hall to witness. I want to slow down here for a while, because we are moving now into the part of the evening where the pace of the whole palace begins, gradually, to change, and I think it is worth simply staying inside that shift with you, rather than rushing through it. The music continues, softer now than it was earlier, the more energetic dances giving way, as the evening deepens, to slower, quieter pieces, a lute perhaps, or a small consort of viols, playing something Elizabeth herself might once have played on the virginals in a private hour. Courtiers begin drifting from the hall in smaller groups, some toward their own chambers elsewhere in the sprawling palace, others simply finding quieter corners to continue conversations that had been impossible over the noise of dancing. The candles are not extinguished yet, not for hours still, but something in the room has softened, the sharp, watchful formality of the afternoon audience feeling, by comparison, like it belongs to an entirely different day. Elizabeth remains a while longer, speaking quietly with 2 or 3 of her closest women, the same small trusted circle who dressed her this morning, and who will, before too many more hours pass, begin the long careful work of undressing her again. There is something almost circular in that, if you think about it for a moment. The way this entire day, for all its ceremony and audiences and elaborate performance, is bounded on both ends by these same few faces, the same quiet hands, the same practiced intimacy that no ambassador, no council member, no visiting foreign dignitary is ever permitted to witness. Outside, somewhere beyond the tall windows, the palace grounds have gone properly dark now, gravel paths and clipped hedges visible only where torchlight or the glow from lit windows happens to reach them. A guard's footsteps cross a distant courtyard, slow and unhurried, the particular rhythm of someone walking a route they have walked 1,000 times before and will walk 1,000 times again. Somewhere further off, a dog barks once, twice, and falls silent, the kind of ordinary night sound that exists in every century, entirely unconcerned with pearls or politics or the particular queen sleeping, eventually somewhere inside these walls. Eventually Elizabeth withdraws to her private chambers, and the same women who spent nearly 2 hours constructing her this morning now spend a comparable stretch of time, quiet and unhurried, taking all of it apart again. It begins with the jewels, each piece lifted away carefully and handed to a woman whose specific responsibility tonight is simply counting, checking every ring, every pearl rope, every brooch against a list kept for exactly this purpose, because royal jewels represented genuine, substantial wealth, and nothing here was ever handled carelessly, not even at the end of a long day, when everyone in the room is undoubtedly tired. Each piece is returned to its case, wrapped in soft cloth, the case itself eventually locked away by an officer of the jewel house, a small formal ritual closing out a day that began, all those hours ago, with these same pieces being fastened on one by one. The ruff comes next, unpinned with real care to avoid crushing the pleats unnecessarily, since tomorrow it may well be pressed and worn again rather than replaced entirely. The gown follows, unlaced and lifted away in careful stages, sleeves detached first, then the bodice, then the heavy skirt, each piece hung or folded precisely according to methods meant to keep silk and velvet from creasing overnight. The stomacher, stiff and embroidered, comes away next, and finally the farthingale itself, that wide-hooped structure that shaped Elizabeth's entire silhouette all day, now simply set aside, an empty architecture waiting to be filled again tomorrow morning. Underneath all of it, she is smaller than the day's version of her, considerably smaller, a genuinely tired woman in her 60s whose body has spent 12 or more hours inside boning and heavy fabric and the sheer physical weight of pearls and embroidery. I find this moment, whenever I picture it clearly, quietly moving in a way the grand public version of her day never quite manages to be. This is the Queen nobody outside this room ever sees, not Gloriana, not the Virgin Queen smiling carefully at a foreign ambassador. Just Elizabeth, tired, human, being gently unwound from the elaborate architecture that carried her successfully through another day. The wig comes away next, unpinned strand by careful strand, and set on its wooden form, ready for tomorrow's dressing, or for whatever occasion the coming days require. Beneath it, her own hair, thinned by age and likely by years of lead resting close against her scalp, is finally free, and one of her women works through it gently with a comb, a small, quiet, entirely ordinary act of care that has nothing whatsoever to do with performance or politics. This is simply one woman tending to another woman's hair at the end of a long day, the kind of small tenderness that exists in nearly every century, regardless of who happens to be sitting in the chair. Removing the cosmetics takes longest of all, the white paint and the red touch to her lips and cheeks worked away with soft cloths and a gentle wash, likely involving something to help cut through the greasy base many of these preparations use to help them adhere to skin throughout a long day. It cannot have been entirely pleasant, this part. Hours of careful removal after hours of equally careful application, and I do wonder sometimes, thinking about this quietly, what it must have felt like to watch her own genuinely aged, scarred, entirely human face reappear slowly in whatever small mirror sat nearby, after an entire day spent as something closer to a symbol than a woman. There is no surviving record of her private thoughts during this particular hour, of course, and I want to be careful not to invent feelings for her that we cannot actually know. What we can say, with real confidence, is that this transition happened every single night of her adult reigning life, thousands of times across 4 decades, the careful daily construction and equally careful nightly dismantling of an image she herself had built and maintained with genuine skill and genuine deliberate purpose. Whatever she felt in this particular hour, she felt it by the 1590s with the accumulated weight of literally thousands of nearly identical evenings behind her. Fresh linen follows, a clean shift replacing the day's undergarments, and the same warm scented water from this morning's washing makes its return now in a smaller, quieter version, a soft cloth passed once more over her face and hands, closing the day much the way it opened, gently, deliberately, in the careful hands of women who have done this for years. There is a detail from these later years of her reign that I think about often, and it belongs here, in this quiet hour between the day's performance and the night's rest, more than almost anywhere else in tonight's story. Several accounts from courtiers and visitors describe Elizabeth, by her final years, growing increasingly reluctant to look at herself in anything but the most flattering, most carefully controlled light, and at least one later tradition holds that mirrors were removed from some of her private rooms altogether, or at minimum kept deliberately few and carefully managed, so that the version of her own face she encountered daily remained, as much as possible, the version she preferred to see rather than the one that had actually developed underneath decades of paint and time. I want to be careful here, because this particular detail sits closer to persistent court tradition than to firmly documented fact, the kind of story that circulated among those who knew her without necessarily being recorded with full certainty by any single reliable witness. But whether or not it happened in precisely this form, the underlying truth it points toward feels entirely consistent with everything else we have walked through tonight. A woman who had spent an entire adult lifetime constructing and defending a public image of untouched, ageless beauty would have had every reason to control, as carefully as she controlled nearly everything else in her world, even the private, unguarded moment of simply catching sight of her own reflection. There is something quietly sad in that, if it is true, and something quietly understandable too. We are not so different, most of us, in some smaller version of this same impulse, choosing certain mirrors over others, certain light over other light, certain moments to look closely and certain moments to look away. Elizabeth simply lived this ordinary human impulse at an extraordinary scale, with an entire household organized carefully around protecting her from whatever she preferred not to see, in the mirror or anywhere else. Let me tell you about the wardrobe itself for a moment, the actual physical scale of it, because I think the number alone does something the description so far has not quite managed to do. By the time of her death, inventories of Elizabeth's wardrobe recorded literally several thousand items of clothing, gowns and kirtles and cloaks and sleeves counted individually, each one logged, maintained and stored by the Office of the Robes we mentioned earlier tonight, an entire department of the royal household existing for the sole purpose of managing what one woman, however extraordinary her position, might wear on any given day. New gowns arrived constantly, some commissioned directly, many others given as gifts, because by long tradition, courtiers seeking royal favour understood that fine clothing, jewellery and other luxury items made welcome and strategically valuable New Year's presents, a custom formalised enough that careful lists were kept each year recording exactly what each courtier had given and, just as importantly, what Elizabeth had given in return, gifts flowing in both directions as a kind of ongoing, carefully tracked economy of loyalty and favour. A particularly fine gown, presented at exactly the right moment by exactly the right courtier, could function as a genuinely significant piece of political strategy, dressed up, quite literally, as simple generosity. Maintaining a wardrobe this size required its own considerable staff, women and men responsible for storage, for repair, for keeping careful records of which gown had been worn on which occasion, since appearing twice in identical dress before the same important audience was considered, at minimum, a small failure of proper royal presentation. Fabric itself, silk and velvet, and cloth of gold and cloth of silver, arrived from merchants across Europe, some of it extraordinarily expensive, dyes and embroidery thread and pearls purchased in quantities that represented a genuinely significant portion of royal household spending across any given year. All of this, ultimately, in service of exactly the process we walked through together this morning, an hour or two of careful dressing that drew on literally thousands of individual garments, maintained by dozens of hands, simply so that one woman could walk through a presence chamber looking, to everyone watching, effortlessly, timelessly magnificent. Summer, in Elizabeth's world, meant something rather different from what we are picturing tonight, a season when the court itself packed up and moved, travelling in a great slow procession from one noble estate to another, across weeks at a time, a practice known as the royal progress. Hosting the Queen for even a single night represented an almost unbelievable expense and an equally unbelievable honour. Noble families spending fortunes preparing rooms, gardens, entertainments and feasts, elaborate enough to satisfy a monarch who had by this point in her reign seen more spectacular hospitality than almost anyone alive. She is not travelling tonight, the particular evening we have spent inside, but summers like these had filled decades of her reign, and I imagine, lying quietly now as her women finish their final small tasks around her, that some of those memories might drift back to her in exactly this kind of unguarded, half-awake hour. Kenilworth Castle, decades earlier now, where one of her favourite courtiers had staged entertainments so extravagant, fireworks and floating pageants on the lake, music continuing long into the night, that accounts of it circulated across Europe for years afterward. Whether she thinks of it tonight specifically, we cannot know, of course, but these kinds of memories, vivid, sensory, genuinely joyful, sit somewhere underneath the careful, controlled monarch we have spent most of tonight's story observing, evidence of an entire private emotional life that mostly stayed exactly where private things belonged, tucked away behind the same doors that separate her chamber from the rest of this sleeping palace. The progresses had grown rarer by these later years, her own age and the sheer logistical burden of moving an entire court across the countryside making the practice considerably harder to sustain than it once had been. But the palace still holds, in its way, the accumulated memory of all those earlier summers, in the gowns that had travelled with her to a dozen different noble houses, in the jewels given by hosts eager to impress her, in whatever quiet private satisfaction a woman in her 60s might allow herself, remembering a version of her own life considerably more physically vigorous than the one her body permits her now. Here is one more strange detail worth sharing before we settle fully into the closing hours of tonight's story, because it is exactly the kind of thing that tends to stay with people once they hear it. Elizabeth wore a coronation ring placed on her finger during the ceremony that made her queen back in 1559, and by most surviving accounts, she wore that same ring continuously for the remainder of her life, never removing it, treating it, in a sense, as a kind of symbolic marriage between herself and her kingdom, the very same idea she leaned on so heavily whenever the question of an actual human marriage arose at court. Decades of constant wear meant the ring had, by these later years, essentially become part of her finger, the flesh growing gradually around the metal the way skin sometimes does around something worn without pause for that long. When she eventually died, several years after the particular night we have spent with her tonight, the ring reportedly had to be cut away from her finger before it could be sent north, as a symbolic confirmation of her death, to the man who would become her successor. A single small object, worn without interruption for the better part of 45 years, carrying inside it an entire private philosophy about duty and marriage and the particular version of devotion Elizabeth had chosen, quite deliberately, to build her whole public identity around. I find myself returning to that image more than almost anything else we have discussed tonight, honestly. Not the pearls, not the wig, not even the elaborate painted mask of her public face, but this one small ring, quietly present through every single day we have walked through together, through every audience and every meal and every ceremony, worn so continuously and for so long that her own body had, in its own patient way, simply grown to accommodate it. There is one more piece of strangeness worth mentioning, this one reaching back to the very beginning of her reign rather than the end of it, but it belongs somewhere in tonight's story because it shows just how thoroughly Elizabeth's world blended what we would now separate cleanly into science and superstition. Before her coronation, decades before the evening we are inside tonight, the exact date of the ceremony had been chosen with the deliberate input of a mathematician and astrologer named John Dee, consulted specifically to identify the most astrologically favourable day for the new queen to be crowned. Dee remained a figure at the edges of court life for years afterward, consulted periodically on matters ranging from navigation to the calendar to questions considerably stranger than either of those, and Elizabeth herself, by multiple surviving accounts, took astrology considerably more seriously across her life than a modern reader might expect from someone we tend to remember primarily as a shrewd, rational political operator. This was not unusual for her era, to be fair. Astrology, alchemy, and what we would now call natural science sat considerably closer together in the Tudor mind than they do in ours, respected scholars moving fluidly between all three without any particular sense of contradiction. I mention this not to suggest Elizabeth was somehow credulous or foolish, because nothing else in tonight's story supports that reading of her at all, but because it adds one more genuinely strange thread to everything else we have gathered about her tonight. A woman capable of outmaneuvering ambassadors, managing a fractious council, and maintaining a public image of ageless perfection for decades through sheer disciplined effort, who also, quite sincerely, wanted her coronation to fall on an astrologically auspicious day. Both things were true at once, and I think that particular contradiction tells you something honest about how differently this era organized its understanding of the world, compared to how we organize ours. There is a subject that hangs over nearly every year of this particular decade of Elizabeth's reign, rarely spoken aloud directly in her presence, though everyone at court thinks about it constantly: the succession. Elizabeth has no children, has never married, and by the 1590s she is a woman well into her 60s, at a time when reaching that age at all counted as a genuine achievement, let alone continuing to rule a kingdom with the same evident sharpness she displayed decades earlier. Who follows her, when the moment finally comes, remains formally unresolved, a question Elizabeth herself had deflected, delayed, and refused to settle publicly across the entirety of her reign, for reasons that were, at least in part, entirely strategic. A named successor, she understood well, could become a rival centre of power, a focus for exactly the kind of plotting and division she had spent decades carefully preventing. Courtiers speculate about it constantly, in quiet corners of exactly the kind of evening we have spent tonight walking through. Careful conversations conducted well out of the Queen's hearing, alliances and possibilities weighed and reweighed among men who understand that whoever eventually wears the crown next will reshape the entire landscape of English power, rewarding some families and considerably diminishing others. Elizabeth herself, whatever private thoughts she carries on the subject, maintains in public the same careful, deflecting silence she has maintained for decades, a silence that had, by this point, become almost a policy in its own right. I find something quietly remarkable in her ability to hold this particular tension for so long. Honestly, an entire kingdom's future left formally unresolved by deliberate choice, year after year, decade after decade, while she herself continued the daily work of ruling as though the question simply did not exist. Whatever anxiety the uncertainty caused elsewhere in the palace, and it caused a great deal, Elizabeth's own outward composure on the subject rarely, if ever, cracked in any way the historical record preserves clearly for us tonight. Elizabeth's temper was by nearly every account left by the people who worked closely around her a genuinely real and occasionally quite sudden thing, and I think it deserves a mention tonight because it softens, in a useful way, the almost impossibly composed image we have spent so much of this story constructing. She could be, by multiple surviving descriptions, sharp-tongued, quick to anger over careless mistakes, and entirely capable of letting a servant or even a senior courtier know exactly how displeased she felt in the moment, sometimes with real volume, sometimes with a cutting quietness that unsettled people considerably more than shouting would have. There are stories, some more reliably documented than others, of small objects thrown in frustration, of ladies-in-waiting reduced to tears after a sharp reprimand over some minor failure in her dress or her rooms, of courtiers who had genuinely displeased her, finding themselves banished from her presence for weeks or months at a time, until her temper cooled, and whatever offence had caused it faded sufficiently from her memory. Her famous relationship with the Earl of Essex, a favoured courtier considerably younger than herself, cycled through periods of real affection and periods of genuine, sometimes public fury across these particular years, tension that would eventually, not long after the evening we are inside tonight, curdle into open rebellion and Essex's own execution, though that particular unravelling still lies somewhat ahead of us on this specific night. I mention all of this not to undercut anything we have said about her composure and her careful theatrical control, because both things were entirely true at once. She managed her public image with extraordinary discipline across 4 decades, and she was also, underneath that discipline, a genuinely human woman capable of real anger, real affection, real disappointment, feelings that occasionally broke through the careful surface in front of the very people whose job it was to help maintain it. That combination, control and genuine feeling coexisting in the same person, feels considerably more honest to me than either extreme alone would. Animals moved through this world more than you might expect, and Elizabeth's own fondness for certain creatures offers another small, warmer thread worth following for a moment. She kept small dogs, favoured companions that appear in several portraits and household accounts across her reign, creatures permitted a closeness to her that very few humans outside her most trusted circle ever received, curled near her feet during long council sessions or carried by an attendant as she walked through the gardens we described earlier tonight. There is something quietly touching in that particular detail, the idea that even a monarch this thoroughly surrounded by calculation and performance found some genuine, uncomplicated comfort in the company of a small dog who wanted essentially nothing from her except exactly what dogs have always wanted from the people who care for them. Horses, too, played a considerable role across her life, ridden for pleasure and for the hunting she pursued so enthusiastically in earlier decades, and even now, in her 60s, she is said to have maintained real skill and real evident enjoyment on horseback, whenever her schedule and her health permitted it. The Tower menagerie, meanwhile, housed considerably more exotic creatures, lions among them, maintained across successive reigns as a kind of living display of royal power and reach, a place occasionally visited by courtiers and foreign visitors curious to see animals that most people living in England would otherwise never encounter in their entire lives. I like sitting with this particular thread for a moment, before we move on, honestly, because it reminds me that even inside a life this heavily constructed, this endlessly performed for one audience or another, ordinary affection still found its way through. A small dog settling against her skirts during a long afternoon of state papers, a horse she trusted enough to ride at real speed, decades into a reign that could easily have made her considerably more cautious than that. These are not the details that make it into most retellings of Elizabeth's story, and yet they feel to me like some of the truest ones. Later in the evening, before the final undressing we described a little earlier, Elizabeth sometimes retreated for a private hour to her own virginals, the small keyboard instrument she had learnt as a girl, and continued playing, by every account, with real and genuine skill throughout her adult life. This particular pleasure belonged almost entirely to her, rarely performed for a large audience, reserved instead for a handful of trusted women, or occasionally enjoyed in something closer to genuine solitude, one of the very few moments across her entire day that approached anything like true private leisure. A visiting Scottish diplomat, some years before the evening we are inside tonight, left behind an account of overhearing her play, apparently without her full awareness that she was being listened to, describing her skill with real, unguarded admiration. Elizabeth, upon later learning she had been overheard, reportedly responded with some embarrassment, a small, entirely human reaction that sits rather charmingly alongside everything else we know about her careful, practiced public composure. It is not every day, after all, that a woman capable of holding an entire foreign audience in careful, controlled command finds herself genuinely flustered over being caught doing something as simple and as private as playing music for her own pleasure. I return to this story often, honestly, because it captures something the rest of tonight's narration has mostly kept at arm's length. Underneath the pearls, underneath the wig, underneath the carefully deployed silences and the calculated compliments exchanged with ambassadors, there remained a woman who simply loved music, who played it for herself, quietly, in whatever few private hours her extraordinary life still allowed her, and who blushed, apparently, at the idea of anyone catching her doing something so entirely unguarded. Let us return briefly to the apothecary's world, because I mentioned physicians and humours earlier tonight without fully describing the physical objects and remedies that actually filled the cabinets and shelves surrounding Elizabeth's ordinary care. A royal apothecary maintained an extensive stock of prepared remedies, cordials distilled from herbs, and occasionally precious substances believed to strengthen the heart or settle the stomach, plasters spread on cloth and applied directly to the skin for aches or swelling, sweet-smelling waters distilled from roses or orange blossoms, used both medicinally and simply for pleasure, and powders mixed for everything from headache to digestive complaint, each preparation following recipes passed down through generations of practitioners, refined slowly over centuries, rather than tested in any way we would recognize as scientific today. Certain ingredients considered especially valuable, unicorn horn among them, which in practice meant narwhal tusk, or occasionally rhinoceros horn, believed capable of detecting or neutralizing poison, a belief that connects directly back to the very real anxiety about assassination we discussed earlier tonight. Bezoar stones, hardened masses formed in the digestive systems of certain animals, carried similar protective reputations, treasured and occasionally set into jewelry specifically so they could be dipped into a cup of suspect wine as a precaution before drinking. None of this reflects anything close to how we understand medicine and poison today, and yet within the logic of this particular world, it made a genuine kind of coherent sense, an entire system of protection built around substances believed to carry real, tangible power against exactly the threats a queen in Elizabeth's position had every reason to take seriously. Gold itself appeared in some remedies, ground fine and mixed into cordials believed to strengthen the heart, a practice that tells you something about how thoroughly wealth and healing had become entangled in the medical imagination of this era, the most precious substances in the kingdom pressed into service, quite literally, in the ongoing project of keeping its queen alive and well. Portraits deserve one more return visit before we finish tonight, because the actual sitting process reveals something worth knowing about how carefully this queen managed even the smallest details of her own visual legacy. By her later reign, painters were not always required to work directly from Elizabeth's own aging face at all. A pattern existed, an officially approved face, sometimes called the Mask of Youth by later art historians studying this period, a template capturing an idealized, ageless version of her features that artists could apply to new compositions without necessarily requiring a fresh sitting from the Queen herself, who had understandably limited patience for the long hours a proper portrait sitting demanded. This explains something that puzzles people encountering Elizabeth's portraiture for the first time: the strange consistency of her face across images produced years and even decades apart. A face that barely seems to age at all across paintings that, based on the clothing and jewelry depicted, clearly belong to very different points in her reign. It was not an accident, and it was not simply artistic flattery in the ordinary sense either. It reflected, quite deliberately, an official policy, carefully maintained, that the Queen's public image should project timeless authority rather than any accurate documentary record of her actual changing appearance. Certain portraits from these later years lean even further into this symbolic territory, surrounding her with elaborate allegorical detail. A rainbow held in one hand alongside a Latin motto suggesting that no rainbow exists without the sun, positioning Elizabeth herself as a source of light and order for her entire kingdom. Other paintings place her standing on a map of England, her feet planted somewhere near the location of a specific favoured courtier's estate. Small deliberate choices layered into every composition, each one another piece of the same enormous, carefully sustained project of image, the one we have been tracing, piece by piece, since the very first candle was lit in her bedchamber this morning. The women who surrounded Elizabeth day and night were not, it is worth understanding, a single undifferentiated group. Real hierarchy governed this world too, just as it governed nearly everything else at this court. Ladies of the Privy Chamber, drawn typically from families of considerable existing rank, held the closest daily access. The women who dressed her, who tended her most private moments, who had earned, often across decades, the kind of deep trust that comes only with sustained proximity. Maids of honour, by contrast, tended to be younger, unmarried women, often placed at court specifically because a position near the Queen offered genuine opportunity, both for the young woman herself and for the family who had secured her that placement, a chance to be seen, to make connections, occasionally even to catch the eye of a suitable husband among the many ambitious young men circulating through this same court. Competition among these women could run genuinely deep, quiet rivalries over precedence, over favour, over which lady might be chosen for a particular honour or task on a particular day, all of it playing out beneath a surface of careful, practised courtesy. Elizabeth herself, by most accounts, managed this small internal world of her household with real attentiveness, aware of tensions among her ladies, the same way she remained aware of tensions among her male counsellors, and occasionally intervening, rewarding, or gently disciplining exactly as the situation required. Marriage among these women required royal permission, a rule enforced with real seriousness, and Elizabeth's reaction to unauthorized matches among her ladies could be genuinely severe. Imprisonment in the Tower not unheard of for a lady who had married secretly and without the Queen's prior consent. It is a strange thing to sit with, honestly, the idea that even the romantic lives of the women closest to her fell, in some real practical sense, under her personal jurisdiction, one more layer of control extending outward from the Queen's own carefully managed existence into the lives of nearly everyone orbiting closest around her. Fire was a constant, quiet danger in a world lit almost entirely by open flame, and it is worth pausing on this for a moment as the palace settles further into night, because it shaped a great deal of how these rooms actually operated after dark. Candles of beeswax, considerably more expensive and cleaner burning than the tallow candles used in less privileged parts of the household, lit Elizabeth's own chambers, but even beeswax candles required constant careful attention, wicks trimmed regularly to prevent smoking or guttering, holders positioned well clear of hanging fabric, curtains and the wide flammable sweep of any gown left carelessly near an open flame. A groom of the chamber typically held responsibility for exactly this kind of vigilance, checking candles through the evening, banking the fire in the hearth to a safe, steady glow, rather than an open blaze before the household finally settled for the night, ensuring nothing had been left burning unattended in any room the Queen might pass through on her way to bed. Palace fires, when they did occur, could be genuinely catastrophic, and the accumulated caution around open flame reflected real, hard-learned experience rather than simple excessive fussiness. By the hour we are approaching now, most of the candles throughout the wider palace have already been extinguished or reduced to a bare minimum. corridors falling into a deep, uneven darkness broken only by the occasional lantern carried by a guard on his rounds, or a single candle left burning outside a door that might still need attending overnight. Elizabeth's own chambers remain lit a while longer, a few candles kept burning low as the final preparations for sleep continue, their light throwing long soft shadows across tapestried walls that have watched this same nightly ritual unfold for as many years as anyone currently in the room can properly remember. Before we follow Elizabeth fully into bed tonight, I want to share something about how sleep itself worked in this era, because it is genuinely different from how most of us sleep now, and I think it belongs in a story like this one. Historians studying diaries, court records, and household accounts from across this period have found consistent evidence of what is now often called segmented sleep, a pattern where a full night was commonly divided into two distinct stretches, a first sleep beginning shortly after retiring, followed by a waking period sometime in the middle of the night lasting perhaps an hour or so, before a second sleep carried the sleeper through until morning. This waking interval was not considered a problem or a disturbance the way we might think of interrupted sleep today. It was simply an ordinary part of the night, a quiet stretch used for prayer, for reflection, for quiet conversation if another person happened to be nearby, occasionally even for small household tasks that suited the still, undisturbed hours of deep night. Whether Elizabeth herself experienced her nights in exactly this segmented pattern, we cannot say with certainty from any single surviving record describing her specifically, but the practice was common enough across this era among people of every rank that it would have been entirely unremarkable if she did. I find something quietly reassuring in this actually, especially tonight, especially for you, listening in whatever dark room currently surrounds you. If you wake tonight in the middle of the night, briefly, quietly, and find yourself simply lying there for a while before drifting back under, you are doing something entirely ordinary, something people have done for centuries, something Elizabeth herself, 400 years ago, in a curtained bed inside a stone palace, may well have done too. There was never anything wrong with waking in the night. It was simply how nights, for a very long time, tended to work. The bed itself deserves a slow, careful look before we finally climb into it alongside her tonight, because it is in its own way as elaborate a piece of construction as anything we have already walked through this evening. A great carved wooden frame, likely oak, rises well above head height, supporting a canopy called a tester overhead, from which heavy curtains hang on all sides, embroidered fabric, sometimes velvet, sometimes richly worked wool, capable of being drawn completely closed to enclose the sleeper in a private, dark, considerably warmer pocket of air than the rest of the draughty stone room around it. Beneath the visible bedding lies a deep feather mattress, resting on a lower support mattress stuffed with wool or straw, the whole arrangement considerably softer and more comfortable than most people in this era, outside the wealthiest households, would ever have access to in their own homes. Linen sheets, changed regularly, lie beneath layered blankets and a final rich coverlet, and somewhere in the preparation of this particular bed this evening, a warming pan, a covered metal container filled with hot coals, will likely have been passed briefly between the sheets to take the deep chill off them before Elizabeth actually climbs in, a small, careful comfort performed quietly by an attendant a short while before she retires. The curtains themselves serve a purpose considerably more practical than simple decoration. Drawn fully closed, they trap warmth, block drafts that a stone palace produces constantly regardless of season, and create, in effect, a small private room within the larger room, a final enclosed layer of privacy in a life that has offered remarkably little genuine privacy anywhere else across the many hours we have spent following her tonight. I like to imagine that final moment, the curtains drawn quietly closed around her, the muffled sound of the wider room fading slightly behind heavy fabric, the Queen finally, however briefly, however incompletely, alone. Let me take you back briefly to something that happens once each year at this court, because it captures a different, more openly celebratory side of Elizabeth's public life than almost anything else we have discussed tonight. Each November, the anniversary of her accession to the throne back in 1558 is marked with an elaborate tournament known as the Accession Day Tilt, held at Whitehall before enormous crowds, knights competing in armour, decorated with personal symbols and devices, jousting in her honour before a queen seated in a place of careful prominence to watch the entire spectacle unfold. These tournaments had grown, across the decades of her reign, into genuine popular celebrations, drawing ordinary Londoners alongside the nobility, an early and remarkably successful piece of what we might now recognise as public relations, an entire kingdom invited annually to celebrate the continued reign of its queen through pageantry, chivalric display, and careful theatrical spectacle designed explicitly to reinforce loyalty and affection. Knights competing in the tilt often incorporated elaborate personal symbolism into their armour and their entrance, presenting themselves before Elizabeth with speeches, costumes, and staged allegorical performances, specifically composed to flatter and celebrate her, competing in a sense for her favour and attention nearly as much as for victory in the actual physical contest. I mention this because it offers a genuinely joyful counterweight to some of the stranger, more uncomfortable details we have spent tonight exploring. Whatever the private cost of maintaining this extraordinary public image, decades of paint and pearls and careful performance, it produced, among other things, moments of real, widely shared celebration, an entire kingdom gathering once a year specifically to honour a queen who had, against considerable odds at the beginning of her reign, held her throne successfully for well over 3 decades by the particular autumn we are approaching in tonight's calendar. The guards who watch over this palace tonight, and every night, belong mostly to a body known as the Yeomen of the Guard, a formal royal bodyguard established generations before Elizabeth's own birth, and maintained carefully across her entire reign, distinctive in their red and gold livery, tall and carefully selected men whose presence at every formal occasion we have described tonight, the audience with the ambassador, the ceremonial meals, the evening entertainment, has quietly framed nearly every scene without ever once stepping into its actual centre. At night, their duties shift toward exactly the kind of quiet, steady vigilance we mentioned earlier. Watches posted at key doors and passages leading toward the royal apartments, rotating through the darkest hours in shifts that ensure no stretch of night ever passes with these particular thresholds genuinely unguarded. It is unglamorous work, most of it standing quietly in torchlit corridors while the rest of the palace sleeps, and yet it represents one more layer of the same extraordinary structure we have traced all night, an entire elaborate system, human and architectural both, organised around the singular purpose of keeping one specific woman safe, comfortable, and properly attended, hour after hour, for as long as her reign continues. A guard posted somewhere near the entrance to the privy apartments tonight shifts his weight slightly, the small unconscious movement of someone who has stood roughly in this same spot for several hours already, and will stand here for several more before his watch ends and another man takes his place. Somewhere beyond him, muffled by stone and distance and the heavy curtains we described a moment ago, the Queen herself is finally nearly ready for sleep. Prayer comes once more before sleep, a shorter, quieter version than the formal chapel service we described earlier in the day, conducted here in the privacy of her own chamber, her chaplain or occasionally simply her own private devotion carrying her through familiar words she has spoken, in one form or another, every single night of her adult life. Elizabeth's own faith, shaped so deliberately across the decades of her reign, carried real personal weight alongside its obvious political dimensions, and there is no particular reason to doubt that these closing prayers of the day held genuine private meaning for her, whatever public function religion also served throughout the rest of her rule. A prayer book lies nearby, well used, its pages likely marked in places by years of regular handling, perhaps even annotated in her own hand in the margins here and there. A small private habit several Tudor monarchs shared, treating a prayer book not simply as a formal object, but as something closer to a genuine, ongoing conversation conducted across years of quiet private use. Candlelight catches the edge of its pages as she closes it for the night, the same soft golden light that has followed us through nearly every scene of tonight's story, now narrowing down toward this single small, quiet moment. The chamber vessel makes its final appearance of the day here too, tucked discreetly behind its folding screen, attended once more by the same trusted woman who oversaw it this morning, a small closing symmetry to a day that began and will end with essentially identical private rituals, performed by essentially the same small circle of trusted hands. There is something almost peaceful in that repetition, honestly, the way this entire extraordinary day, filled with ambassadors and pearls and elaborate performance, ultimately narrows back down to the same handful of quiet, ordinary, deeply human moments that framed it from the very start. Let us leave her chamber for a moment, quietly, the way you might slip out of a room where someone has just fallen asleep, and wander a little through the rest of this sleeping palace, because there is something worth noticing in how much of this enormous building continues working steadily through the night, entirely unconcerned with the Queen's own rest. Down in the kitchens, far below the privy apartments, the great fires have been banked rather than fully extinguished, glowing coals kept carefully alive under a covering of ash, so that tomorrow's cooking can begin quickly, without the hours of effort a fire built entirely from scratch would otherwise require. A scullion or two might still be finishing the last of the evening's cleaning, scouring pots in cooling water by the light of a single tallow candle, moving slowly now, the particular tiredness of a long day settling into shoulders and hands that will need to rise again before dawn regardless. The air down here smells nothing like the perfumed richness of the hall we described earlier tonight. It smells of wood smoke and cooked fat and the faint mineral dampness of stone floors that never quite dry out completely, whatever the season. Out beyond the kitchens, in stables set some distance from the main palace buildings, horses shift occasionally in their stalls, the soft sound of hooves against straw and packed earth, a groom perhaps still awake nearby, tending to some minor task or simply keeping half an ear open for any sign of trouble among the animals in his care. The formal gardens Elizabeth walked through this afternoon lie completely dark now, their careful geometric patterns invisible except where a little moonlight happens to catch the pale gravel of a path or the edge of a clipped hedge. The fountains silent, the whole space holding a kind of stillness considerably different from its busy daytime version, and honestly, in its own quiet way, just as beautiful. In the laundry rooms, somewhere in a lower, more utilitarian part of the palace, some of tomorrow's linen is already soaking, great vats of water and mild soap working slowly through the night on shifts and shirts and smaller pieces that will need to be ready fresh by morning, the same relentless cycle of washing and starching and pressing that keeps a household this size properly clothed, continuing quietly on, regardless of the hour, regardless of who happens to be asleep elsewhere in the building at any given moment. A single laundress, perhaps, still moves between vats by lantern light, her hands red and slightly swollen from hours spent in water that has long since gone lukewarm, humming something quietly to herself, the way people doing repetitive, solitary work often do, mostly without noticing they are doing it at all. Elsewhere, in the rooms belonging to the Office of the Robes, tomorrow's gown has very likely already been selected and laid out, inspected once more by careful, practiced hands for any flaw the morning's rush might otherwise miss. A fresh ruff set aside already starched and ready, jewellery that had been locked away only an hour or two earlier, already quietly reconsidered for tomorrow's particular occasion, whatever that occasion happens to be. The machinery that produced the extraordinary version of Elizabeth we watched assembled this morning never actually stops, not really. It simply pauses, briefly, in its most visible form, while continuing steadily forward in dozens of smaller, quieter tasks scattered throughout the sleeping building. I find something genuinely moving in this, sitting with it now, this picture of an entire vast household continuing to breathe and work and prepare, hour after hour, in service of a single sleeping woman 2 floors above them who will likely never know most of their names, and who depends, nonetheless, completely and entirely on every single one of them doing their quiet work well. Elizabeth is alone now, or as close to alone as she is ever genuinely permitted to be. The curtains drawn around her bed, a single woman keeping watch in an outer chamber close enough to hear if she is called, close enough to remain, in the strictest sense, still present, and yet far enough that the small private world inside these curtains belongs, for the first time all day, almost entirely to her. Her mind, in these final drifting minutes before sleep properly takes her, does not necessarily follow any particular order, the way minds rarely do at this exact hour, and I imagine, though of course I cannot know for certain, that some fragment of memory from decades earlier might surface here, unbidden, the way old memories often do in precisely this kind of quiet, unguarded darkness. Perhaps it is the scar tissue on her own skin beneath tonight's careful paint, a quiet reminder of the smallpox that nearly killed her in her 20s, decades before this particular evening, an illness that had left its mark permanently across her face, and had, in its own way, set in motion the entire elaborate system of cosmetics we walked through together this morning, concealment becoming, gradually, across the following decades, an entire philosophy of rule. Or perhaps, instead, something considerably prouder surfaces in this drifting hour, a memory from several years earlier now, an army gathered at Tilbury while an invasion fleet from Spain approached English waters, Elizabeth herself riding out before her assembled soldiers, dressed, by several accounts, in a symbolic breastplate over her gown, delivering words that would be remembered and repeated for centuries afterward, words about possessing the heart and stomach of a king despite the body of a weak and feeble woman. Whether she thinks of that particular afternoon specifically tonight, we cannot say, but it belongs, unmistakably, among the deepest, most genuinely earned parts of everything we have spent tonight trying to understand about her, proof that underneath every carefully applied layer of paint and pearl, a real and formidable courage had, more than once across this long reign, met a genuine crisis directly, and had not looked away. Tudor understanding of dreams occupied its own particular place in the medical and spiritual thinking of this era, worth a moment of attention here as sleep finally genuinely approaches for her tonight. Dreams were widely believed to carry real meaning, sometimes medical, tied back once more to the balance of humours we discussed earlier, an excess of one particular humour thought capable of producing specific, recognisable kinds of dreams, and sometimes considerably more spiritual or even prophetic in nature, messages worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as simple random firing of a resting mind, which is roughly how we tend to understand dreams now. Books existed specifically for dream interpretation, circulating among the educated classes, offering guidance on what particular dream imagery might signify, and it would not have been unusual for someone in Elizabeth's position to hold at least some genuine interest in what her own dreams might reveal, whether about her health, her fortune, or matters of state weighing on her in her waking hours. Whether she consulted such guidance herself with any real regularity, the record does not tell us clearly, but the broader cultural framework surrounding sleep and dreaming in this era was considerably richer, considerably more meaningful than the mostly forgettable nightly static most of us experience and quickly dismiss today. There is something rather lovely in that idea, honestly, sitting with it now as you drift toward your own rest tonight. A world where dreams were taken seriously, treated as worth remembering, worth discussing, worth genuinely wondering about come morning. Whatever drifts through your own mind in the coming hour, you are welcome to treat it with exactly that same gentle curiosity, the way Elizabeth's own world might have, rather than simply letting it dissolve unnoticed the moment you wake. I want to step back for a moment from this particular night and tell you how differently a day like this one could unfold, depending on the season, because everything we have walked through tonight assumes a mild, fair evening, and Tudor palace life changed considerably once winter properly arrived. Cold reached deep into these stone buildings in ways that modern heating has made almost impossible for us to fully imagine now. Fires burned constantly through winter months in every room of any real importance, tended by staff whose entire responsibility revolved around keeping enough seasoned wood moving through enormous fireplaces to hold back a chill that stone walls, however grand, did remarkably little to prevent. Elizabeth's own winter wardrobe leaned considerably heavier than what we described her wearing this evening, furs added to gowns already heavy with boning and embroidery, an extra layer or two of petticoat beneath the farthingale, gloves lined rather than simply perfumed, the entire elaborate dressing process we walked through this morning taking, if anything, even longer during the coldest months, every layer serving warmth as much as appearance. Windows, glazed though many of them were by this period, a genuine luxury in itself, still let considerably more cold through than we would tolerate today, and tapestries hung along stone walls served a practical purpose beyond decoration, trapping a thin but genuinely useful layer of warm air between fabric and cold stone. Warming pans worked overtime through winter nights, passed through bedding not once but sometimes twice before a person actually climbed in, and the segmented sleep we discussed earlier, that natural middle-of-the-night waking, likely felt considerably more welcome in winter, an excuse to add another log to a dying fire, to pull another blanket close, before settling back for the second half of a long, cold night. Summer, by contrast, brought its own different set of considerations: lighter fabrics where court fashion allowed it, windows opened wherever security permitted, and of course the great summer progresses we discussed earlier, the entire court decamping from London's heat and its considerably less pleasant summer smells toward the countryside, toward fresher air and grander hospitality offered by noble hosts eager for the honour and the opportunity a royal visit represented. There is one more court ceremony worth walking through carefully before we return fully to Elizabeth's own quiet bedroom tonight, because it reveals, in a single concentrated ritual, nearly everything we have discussed about gifts, favour, and careful political calculation across the whole of tonight's story. Each New Year, a formal gift-giving ceremony unfolded at court, meticulously documented in surviving household roles that still exist today, listing exactly what every courtier, every foreign ambassador, every bishop and noble and favoured servant presented to the Queen, and exactly what Elizabeth gave back in return. Gifts arrived in extraordinary variety: embroidered gloves, elaborate jewellery, fine fabric, occasionally something considerably more personal, a book, a piece of music, a small clever trinket chosen specifically to appeal to some known preference of hers. The value and thoughtfulness of a gift carried real political weight, courtiers competing quietly, sometimes not so quietly, to present something that would genuinely please her, genuinely stand out among dozens of similar offerings arriving on the very same day. Elizabeth's own gifts in return, carefully calibrated according to the giver's rank and the perceived value of what they had offered, functioned as a visible, countable measure of royal favour, a courtier receiving something particularly fine, walking away from that ceremony with tangible proof of standing that every other person present would immediately understand and take note of. I find this particular ritual almost dizzying to sit with for very long. Honestly, the sheer scale of calculation folded into something as seemingly simple as exchanging gifts at the start of a new year. Nothing in this world, we have discovered again and again across tonight's story, was ever simply what it appeared to be on the surface. A gown was armour, a pearl was a political statement, a gift was a message, carefully composed, carefully read, and carefully answered in kind. There is one particular loss worth sitting with quietly here, in these final drifting minutes of her day, because I think it explains something real about the woman we have spent tonight following. Robert Dudley, a nobleman she had known since childhood, had remained one of the closest, most consistently present figures in her entire adult life. A man many at court believed she might genuinely have married, had circumstance and calculation and her own careful political reasoning allowed it. He died several years before the particular night we are inside tonight, and by multiple accounts Elizabeth's grief at the news was genuine, immediate, and considerably less composed than nearly anything else we have witnessed from her across this entire story. She is said to have shut herself away for a period following his death, and a small personal letter from him, among his final correspondence to her, was reportedly kept afterward among her most private possessions for the remainder of her own life, marked in her own hand with a brief notation, a small private acknowledgement of something that meant considerably more to her than the careful, controlled language of most royal correspondence ever tends to reveal. Whether that particular letter rests somewhere near her tonight, in this very room, in some drawer or casket close enough to reach without rising, we cannot say for certain, but the underlying grief it represents belongs unmistakably here, in this quiet final hour, alongside everything else drifting through her mind as sleep finally, gently begins to take hold. I think this detail matters enormously for understanding everything else we have discussed tonight, honestly. A woman capable of building and maintaining, across 4 entire decades, one of the most sophisticated public images in the history of any European monarchy, still carried underneath every layer of that careful construction a genuine capacity for private loss, private tenderness, private grief that no amount of pearls or painted composure ever fully managed to conceal, not from the small handful of people who actually knew her, and perhaps, in this particular quiet hour, not even from herself. Here is one final strange ceremony worth knowing about before we let this particular day close completely, because it belongs firmly in the category the title of tonight's story promised you from the very beginning. English monarchs of this era, Elizabeth included, were believed to possess a genuinely miraculous healing power, the ability to cure a condition known as scrofula, a swelling of the lymph glands then commonly called the king's evil, simply through royal touch. Sufferers travelled considerable distances for the chance to be touched by the reigning monarch during formal ceremonies held periodically for exactly this purpose, and Elizabeth, despite the more overtly Catholic association some critics attached to this particular tradition, continued the practice throughout her reign, touching afflicted subjects and offering a blessing, occasionally accompanied by a small gold coin, a specially minted piece called an angel, presented to each person touched. Whether Elizabeth herself held any genuine private belief in the healing power attributed to her touch, or regarded the ceremony primarily as another useful demonstration of divinely sanctioned royal authority, we cannot say with real certainty. What we can say is that the ceremony itself, sufferers kneeling before her, the Queen's bare hand extended to touch swollen glands at the neck or elsewhere, a formal blessing spoken over each person in turn, represented one more layer entirely of what it meant to be a Tudor monarch, a role that blended political authority with something closer to sacred, quasi-religious power in a way that feels almost entirely foreign to how we think about leadership today. I find myself sitting with this one for a while whenever I encounter it. Honestly, the strange, genuine intimacy of it. This same woman who spent hours this morning being protected from nearly every ordinary human touch, who required an entire trusted circle simply to manage her closest daily rituals, willingly extending her bare hand toward strangers, subjects suffering from a visible, uncomfortable illness, in a ceremony that asked her, quite literally, to touch what nearly everything else about her carefully guarded life was otherwise organized to keep at a careful, protective distance. Theatre occupied a genuinely significant place in the culture surrounding Elizabeth's later court, and it is worth pausing on this once more before we let the day close, because the 1590s specifically represent one of the most remarkable periods in the entire history of English drama. Companies of professional players operated under the patronage of various noble households, performing regularly both in London's public playhouses and, on selected occasions, directly before the Queen herself at court. Entertainments arranged through the Master of the Revels, an official household position responsible for licensing plays and organising exactly this kind of royal performance. William Shakespeare's own company, whichever specific patron's name it operated under during any given year of this decade, was very much active during precisely this period, and companies like his did perform before Elizabeth on selected occasions across these years, though we cannot say with certainty that any particular performance occurred on this exact night we have spent together. What we can say is that this general kind of evening, court performers arriving to present a play before the Queen and her assembled household, happened with real regularity throughout these later years of her reign, and that Elizabeth herself, by every account, took genuine pleasure in exactly this kind of entertainment, alongside the music and dancing we discussed earlier tonight. I find something quietly remarkable in simply holding that fact for a moment, the plain historical coincidence of it. Some of the greatest plays ever written in the English language were taking shape during precisely these years, performed sometimes for exactly the kind of court audience we have spent tonight imagining, the same candlelit halls, the same careful hierarchy of seating, the same Queen watching from her place of honour, her painted face and towering ruff catching the light alongside everyone else gathered to watch a story unfold before them, in a room not so very different in its essential human purpose from wherever you happen to be listening tonight. Sleep comes for her now, slowly, the way it comes for anyone at the end of a long day, regardless of crown or kingdom, or the particular weight of whatever business the day has carried. The curtains around her bed hold a close, warm darkness, the faint smell of lavender worked into the linen mixing quietly with the last traces of perfume still clinging to her skin from hours earlier. Rosewater and orange blossom, and something muskier underneath, the accumulated fragrance of an entire long day finally settling, layer by layer, into stillness. Her breathing slows. Whatever thoughts had been circling a few minutes ago, Robert Dudley's letter, the ambassador's careful compliments, the small crisis of the drooping ruff resolved so many hours earlier now, the succession question that never fully leaves any quiet hour of her reign, all of it begins to loosen its grip, the particular loosening that happens to a mind finally permitted to stop working for a while. Outside the curtains, a single candle continues to burn low on a nearby table, its flame small and steady, throwing almost no light at all through the heavy fabric enclosing her. The woman keeping watch in the outer chamber tonight sits quietly near her own smaller light, perhaps working at some small piece of needlework to pass the hours, perhaps simply resting her eyes for a moment, listening for the particular sound of even, settled breathing that will tell her the Queen has finally, properly fallen asleep. When it comes, she will not disturb it. She will simply continue her own quiet watch, one more link in the long, careful chain of hands and eyes that has surrounded Elizabeth every single hour of this entire remarkable day, from the moment she first stirred in this same bed early this morning to this final settling stillness now claiming her, gently, completely, at the close of it. Time moves slowly now, the way it always does in the deepest part of any night, whether you are lying in a curtained Tudor bed or wherever you happen to be resting tonight. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a church bell marks the hour, faint and distant, carried on whatever breeze happens to be moving through the London night this particular evening, and a guard somewhere along his rounds counts the strokes automatically, the way anyone does after enough repetition, without really needing to think about it at all. Guards change at some point during these deep hours, one set of tired men relieved quietly by a fresh set, a brief murmured exchange between them at the threshold of whatever corridor or doorway they are responsible for tonight, before the newly arrived man settles into the same patient stillness his predecessor maintained for the previous several hours. Torches burn low in their brackets along the main passages, replaced periodically by whoever holds responsibility for exactly this small, unglamorous task tonight, ensuring that no stretch of corridor within this enormous building ever falls into complete and total darkness, regardless of the hour. Outside, weather moves across the palace grounds the way weather always does, indifferent to whatever ceremony or crisis happened to unfold within these walls earlier in the day. Perhaps a light rain begins sometime after midnight, soft against stone and slate roof, gathering in shallow puddles along the gravel paths Elizabeth walked so carefully this afternoon in her heavy, swaying gown. Perhaps instead, the sky stays clear, stars visible above the dark shapes of towers and chimneys, indifferent and steady and entirely unconcerned with kingdoms or successions or the particular queen sleeping somewhere below them tonight. Either way, the palace continues its slow, quiet breathing through these hours, fires banked, doors watched, linens soaking, tomorrow's gown already chosen, the whole enormous machine idling gently rather than fully stopping, the way it idles every single night, the way it has idled for as many nights now as anyone currently serving within these walls can properly remember. Somewhere toward the very last hours before dawn, the deepest, stillest part of the night finally arrives, that particular hush that settles over any large sleeping building sometime after the deep dark has fully closed in, and sometime before the first faint hint of grey begins working its way back into the eastern sky. Nothing much happens during these hours, nothing much is supposed to. This is simply rest, the whole vast machinery of this extraordinary life, finally, briefly, allowed to slow all the way down. A few more years remain ahead of her still, beyond this particular quiet night, though of course she cannot know exactly how many, and neither, honestly, can we say with any real precision from where we sit tonight. The pattern we have walked through together this evening, the careful morning construction, the audiences and the council work, the elaborate meals, the quiet private hours at her virginals, the equally careful nightly dismantling of everything built that morning, would repeat itself in one form or another for a good while longer yet, each day its own small variation on the same essential structure, the same trusted hands, the same watchful guards standing patient duty through the same deep, quiet hours. Eventually, of course, as happens to every one of us regardless of crown or kingdom, her own final illness would arrive, and the extraordinary machinery we have spent tonight examining so closely, the paint and the pearls and the carefully maintained image of ageless authority, would finally, gently be permitted to rest alongside her. A successor waited already, quietly acknowledged though never formally named across the whole of her reign, a resolution to that long unspoken question we discussed a little earlier tonight, arriving finally, as these things generally do, not through any dramatic announcement but through the simple, inevitable passage of time. I do not want to dwell too long on that ending tonight though, because it belongs to a different evening's story, a different kind of quiet than the one we have spent building together this particular night. What I want you to carry with you instead, as we finally let this day close completely, is everything that came before it. The tired woman waking alone in a curtained bed, the small circle of trusted hands transforming her, hour by careful hour, into something the entire watching world understood as timeless. The genuine intelligence and genuine humour and genuine grief moving quietly underneath all of it, the whole while, largely unseen by anyone beyond these particular walls. Let me tell you something about the architecture of access itself, the actual physical layout of rooms that shaped nearly everything we have described tonight, because it explains a great deal about how a Tudor palace actually organised the movement of people around a monarch's daily life. Access to Elizabeth was structured, quite literally, in concentric rings of privilege, moving outward from her most private bedchamber, through the privy chamber where only her closest attendants and most trusted counsellors were ever admitted, through the presence chamber where formal audiences like the one we witnessed with the ambassador took place, and finally out into the great hall and the wider public spaces of the palace, where considerably larger numbers of courtiers, visitors, and household staff moved throughout the day without ever expecting to encounter the Queen herself directly at all. Each of these thresholds functioned as a genuine social filter, a person's rank and standing at court measured, quite precisely, by how far inward through this sequence of rooms they were ever actually permitted to travel. A newly arrived courtier might spend months, occasionally years, working simply to earn access from the great hall into the presence chamber, let alone anywhere closer to the Queen's own private rooms. Ambassadors received considerably faster access by virtue of the formal diplomatic status they carried, though even they rarely if ever penetrated beyond the presence chamber into anything resembling genuine privacy. I find this spatial logic genuinely useful for understanding everything else we have discussed tonight, honestly. The elaborate morning ritual, the careful small circle permitted to see her undressed and unpainted, the strict hierarchy among her own ladies, all of it mirrors this same essential architecture of concentric access, physical distance from the Queen's body mapping almost perfectly onto social and political distance from her genuine trust and favour. Whitehall, the sprawling palace complex where this particular story has largely unfolded tonight, embodied this logic at genuinely enormous scale, reportedly the largest palace in Europe by the later years of her reign, room after room after room, each one a slightly different, slightly more restricted layer of the same extraordinary, carefully guarded world. Pearls deserve one more moment of real attention before we close tonight's story completely, because we have mentioned them constantly without ever quite explaining where they actually came from, and the answer tells you something worth knowing about the wider world feeding into this single extraordinary life. The pearls draped so constantly across Elizabeth's gowns and woven through her wigs travelled enormous distances to reach her, many sourced from waters around the Persian Gulf and from the coasts of South Asia, carried by a long chain of merchants and traders across months of sea and overland travel before ever reaching an English jeweller's workshop. This single detail connects Elizabeth's carefully constructed image directly to an entire global network of trade and exploration expanding rapidly across exactly these decades, English ships venturing further and further from home waters throughout her reign, establishing trading connections and, in some cases considerably more aggressive ventures that would eventually reshape England's relationship with the wider world across the centuries following her death. The Queen sitting in her chamber this morning, being dressed in pearls by trusted attendants, existed at the centre of a genuinely vast and rapidly expanding web of commerce and ambition, most of which she would never personally witness, all of it nonetheless converging, quite literally, on the gown laid across her body each and every morning. Diamonds and other precious stones followed similarly long and complicated paths to reach her jewel house, cut and polished by skilled craftsmen working in centres of the trade scattered across Europe, purchased or gifted or occasionally seized through the kind of maritime activity that blurred, in this particular era, rather uncomfortably close to piracy at times. I find something genuinely dizzying in tracing these connections, honestly. The way a single pearl resting quietly against Elizabeth's throat this evening carries within it an entire hidden history of ocean voyages, foreign workshops, and ambitious merchants, none of it visible in the finished gleaming object itself, and none of it, most likely, occupying more than the faintest passing thought in the mind of the woman wearing it. Here is a small practical detail worth knowing, one that connects directly back to the sanitation challenges we discussed earlier tonight, because it explains something about why Elizabeth's court moved between several different palaces throughout the year, rather than remaining permanently in any single one. Whitehall, Greenwich, Richmond, Hampton Court, and several other royal residences scattered across and around London each hosted the court in rotation, and while ceremony and personal preference played some real role in these movements, practical necessity mattered enormously too. A palace housing several hundred people for weeks or months at a time inevitably accumulated exactly the kind of sanitation problems we described earlier: waste, spoiled rushes, the general grime of intensive daily use by a household this size. Periodically vacating a residence allowed a thorough cleaning to take place in the court's absence, floors scrubbed, rushes entirely replaced, latrines and drains cleared properly, walls and hangings aired out, a process sometimes referred to informally as sweetening the house. Moving the entire court to a different palace for a period gave the vacated residence genuine time to be restored to reasonably fresh condition before the Queen and her household eventually returned to it. This rotation also served the households themselves in practical terms, since supplies of food, fuel, and fresh water could be replenished locally at each residence, rather than needing to sustain several hundred people indefinitely from a single location's resources. I find something quietly sensible in all of this, honestly, a system that looks on its surface like simple royal restlessness or ceremonial variety, but that actually reflects careful, practical management of exactly the kind of hygiene and supply challenges that a household this enormous inevitably created, wherever it happened to be staying at any given point across the year. We have spent nearly all of tonight focused on Elizabeth herself and the women who surrounded her most closely, and I want to give the men of this court a brief moment of attention too, because their own daily performance of status through clothing rivaled, in its own way, everything we have described about the Queen's wardrobe. Courtiers competed constantly through fashion, doublets and hose cut from the finest available fabric, elaborate ruffs of their own, though never quite so large as to visually rival the Queen's, jewelled rings and chains of office worn as visible markers of position and favour, a codpiece and padded shoulders shaping a particular masculine silhouette considered fashionable and imposing throughout this period. Ambitious young men arriving at court understood, often quite explicitly, that appearance functioned as a genuine political tool, a well-cut doublet, or a particularly fine cloak, capable of catching a queen's attention in ways that patient years of quiet service sometimes struggled to achieve nearly as quickly. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex we mentioned briefly earlier tonight, was famous even among his contemporaries for exactly this kind of careful self-presentation, cultivating an image of dashing, romantic devotion that Elizabeth for years found genuinely appealing, whatever complications that particular relationship would eventually produce. Behind the fashion, real political rivalry ran constantly beneath the surface of nearly every evening we have described tonight, factions forming and reforming around competing councillors and courtiers, each group manoeuvring carefully for position, for royal favour, for advantage over rivals who occupied, quite literally, the very same crowded rooms night after night, William Cecil, and later his son Robert, held particular sustained influence across these decades, careful, patient administrators whose steady management of state business provided a kind of quiet counterweight to the more flamboyant, more visibly theatrical courtiers competing for attention through fashion and charm alone. Elizabeth managed all of this competing ambition with real, sustained skill, playing rivals carefully against one another when useful, rewarding loyalty when it served her, and never, across 4 decades, allowing any single faction to grow powerful enough to seriously threaten her own final authority over the whole intricate competitive system. Poetry surrounded Elizabeth throughout her reign in ways that reinforced everything we have discussed tonight about her carefully constructed public image. And one particular literary project deserves mention here, because it captures so precisely the symbolic language this entire court had come to speak fluently by these later years. Edmund Spenser, a poet working during exactly this period, composed an enormous allegorical work explicitly built around a fictional queen named Gloriana, a figure widely understood by contemporary readers to represent Elizabeth herself, glorious, virtuous, and functioning as a kind of moral and political ideal toward which the poem's various knightly characters strive across its many books. This was not an isolated literary gesture. Poets, playwrights, and composers across these decades regularly wove flattering allegorical references to Elizabeth into their work, comparing her to classical goddesses, to the moon, to the sun itself, building an entire shared cultural vocabulary of praise that circulated constantly through court entertainments, printed works, and the kind of elaborate pageant entertainment we discussed earlier during her summer progresses. Elizabeth herself understood the political value of exactly this kind of cultural production, and while she did not personally commission every individual work praising her in this fashion, the broader cultural climate of her court actively encouraged and rewarded precisely this kind of symbolic elevation. I find something genuinely fascinating in tracing how thoroughly this symbolic language had saturated nearly every corner of English cultural life by the particular decade we have spent tonight exploring, honestly. The same woman we watched being carefully painted and dressed this morning, worried over a drooping ruff, grieving privately over a lost friend, existed simultaneously as an entire literary and artistic phenomenon, praised in verse by some of the finest poets of her age, transformed repeatedly into goddess and moon and glorious queen by writers who understood, as clearly as anyone at court, exactly how valuable that particular kind of careful, sustained flattery could prove to be. Let me return once more to the entertainments themselves, because we touched on plays and dancing earlier tonight without fully describing the masque, a particular kind of elaborate court performance that deserves its own moment of attention. A masque combined music, dance, elaborate costume, and allegorical storytelling into a single spectacular presentation, courtiers themselves sometimes participating directly alongside professional performers, appearing in fantastic costume as gods, virtues, or mythological figures, moving through carefully choreographed scenes designed specifically to flatter and entertain the queen watching from her seat of honor. Elaborate stage machinery occasionally featured in the grandest of these productions, clouds that could be lowered and raised, temporary structures built specifically for a single night's performance and dismantled shortly afterward, fireworks on the grandest occasions, particularly during the summer progresses we discussed earlier, when hosting nobles competed genuinely to outdo one another in the scale and spectacle of entertainment offered to their royal guest. The famous entertainments at Kenilworth decades earlier had included fireworks visible for miles around, floating pageants staged on the castle's lake, and performances stretching across multiple days, an almost unimaginable scale of expense and effort poured into pleasing a single visiting monarch. By the particular decade we have spent tonight exploring, these entertainments had grown somewhat less frequent. Elizabeth's own advancing age and the court's reduced capacity for the kind of extended travel these grandest spectacles typically required both playing a role in that gradual change. But the underlying appetite for exactly this kind of elaborate, symbolic, genuinely joyful spectacle never fully disappeared from her court. Right through these final years we have spent tonight exploring, evenings like the one we described earlier, music and dancing and careful courtly performance continuing steadily on, a persistent thread of genuine pleasure woven all the way through even the most carefully guarded, most heavily politicized corners of this extraordinary life. Letters and petitions flowed toward Elizabeth constantly throughout every single day of her reign, arriving from every corner of her kingdom and increasingly from considerably further afield, and it is worth understanding just how much of her actual daily labor, beyond the ceremony and the audiences we have spent so much of tonight describing, involved simply reading, considering, and responding to this endless stream of written appeal. Petitioners wrote seeking royal favor, requesting the resolution of some legal dispute, appealing for financial relief, or occasionally simply offering elaborate praise in the hope that flattery alone might catch her attention and produce some small tangible benefit in return. A dedicated staff of secretaries managed the initial sorting of this enormous correspondence, most petitions never reaching Elizabeth's own hands at all, filtered instead through councillors and officials who handled the vast majority of routine business on her behalf. But matters judged genuinely significant, or petitions arriving from individuals of sufficient rank and connection, did eventually reach her own attention, read either by Elizabeth herself or aloud to her by a trusted secretary, her responses dictated or occasionally written in her own hand, a habit that grew somewhat less frequent as she aged, her handwriting in these later years noticeably less steady than the confident, elegant script of her younger decades. I find something worth noticing in this particular labour, honestly, this steady, largely unglamorous work of governance happening constantly underneath everything else we have described tonight. The Queen who dazzled an ambassador this morning, and who will drift before very long now into whatever dreams the night holds for her, spent real, substantial hours across nearly every single day of her reign engaged in exactly this kind of careful, patient, administrative work, reading the concerns and appeals of subjects she would never personally meet, making decisions that shaped lives across an entire kingdom she herself could only ever experience through the narrow, carefully filtered window of letters, reports, and the occasional formal audience granted to whichever petitioner had managed to secure one. Let us return one final time to the quiet room where we began tonight, because everything we have wandered through since then, the pearls and the poetry and the politics, the fireworks and the petitions and the long patient chain of guards standing watch through the deepest hours, all of it circles back, in the end, to this single curtained bed, and the woman finally completely asleep within it. Her breathing has settled now into the slow, even rhythm of genuine rest. Whatever thoughts or memories had drifted through her mind in these final waking minutes now released, at least for a while, into whatever quieter territory dreams occupy. The candle beside her bed has burned down considerably further than it was an hour ago, its flame smaller now, steadier, casting almost no light at all beyond the immediate small circle of the table it rests on. The woman keeping watch nearby has set aside her needlework, her own eyes heavy now too, though her duty keeps her upright and present a while longer yet. One more quiet act of service folded into a day that has been, from its very first moment, built entirely from exactly this kind of quiet, patient service. Notice something here, if you are still with me, still drifting somewhere between waking and sleep yourself. This entire extraordinary day, the audiences and the ceremony, the pearls worth more than most of her subjects would see across their entire lifetimes, the elaborate painted mask constructed fresh every single morning, all of it ends here, in this same simple, universal place. A tired body, finally horizontal, a mind finally permitted to quiet, a room finally dark enough and still enough for rest to properly take hold. Whatever separated Elizabeth from every other person sleeping somewhere across her kingdom tonight, and so much did separate her, the crown and the pearls and the extraordinary weight of the decisions resting on her alone. This final moment belonged to something considerably more ordinary, considerably more shared. Sleep does not care about rank. It comes eventually for queens and scullery maids alike, asking nothing more of either one than the simple willingness to finally, fully let go. Somewhere beyond her window, the night continues its own slow, indifferent progress, entirely unconcerned with kingdoms or crowns. An owl calls once from somewhere among the trees bordering the formal gardens, a sound that would have been just as familiar to anyone lying awake in this same spot 100 years before Elizabeth's birth. and would remain just as familiar to anyone lying awake here 100 years after her death. A light wind moves through the branches, carrying with it the faint mingled smell of damp earth and wood smoke drifting from a dozen banked household fires scattered across the palace grounds. Down in the stables, the horses have long since settled into their own quiet rest, occasional soft shifting in the straw the only sign that anything living remains awake among them at all. In the kitchens, the banked coals continue their slow, patient glow beneath their covering of ash, waiting for whatever hand will eventually stir them back to full flame in the still dark hours before dawn, when the first scullions rise to begin tomorrow's work regardless of how little sleep the night has actually granted them. The laundry vats have gone still and cool now, tomorrow's linen soaking quietly through the remaining hours until someone returns to wring it out and hang it properly before the sun climbs high enough to help with the drying. Everything in this enormous sleeping palace exists, in this particular hour, in exactly the same suspended, patient stillness, guards and horses and banked fires and soaking linen, and one very tired, very carefully guarded queen, all of it held together by the same slow passage of night that has carried every single living thing through darkness since long before any of these particular walls were ever raised, and will continue carrying every living thing through darkness long after every stone of this particular palace has finally inevitably crumbled back into the earth it was built from. It is a strange thing in a way to think about how we actually know her now, all these centuries later, sitting here together in whatever quiet room you happen to be resting in tonight. The portraits we described earlier, that carefully maintained mask of eternal youth, still hang today in galleries and museums across England and beyond. The Rainbow Portrait, the Ditchley Portrait, the Armada Portrait, commemorating that great naval victory over Spain, each one a fragment of the same extraordinary image management project we walked through together tonight, still doing, in its own way, exactly the work it was originally designed to do, presenting Elizabeth to us, hundreds of years later, precisely as she and her court intended her to be seen. Her face appears on coins struck during her own reign, some of them still occasionally surfacing today in museum collections and private hands, and her story has been retold across the centuries since her death in countless plays, novels, and films, each retelling adding its own particular layer of interpretation and imagination onto the considerable historical record that survives from her own actual lifetime. We know her, in other words, through exactly the kind of careful, layered construction we have spent tonight examining so closely: portraits and letters and household accounts, and the occasional startlingly honest ambassador's report, all of it filtered, inevitably, through 4 centuries of retelling and reinterpretation before ever reaching us here tonight. I find something rather moving in that continuity, honestly, sitting with it now in these final quiet minutes of tonight's story. The woman we have spent this entire evening following, waking tired in her curtained bed, worrying over a drooping ruff, grieving privately for a lost friend, delighting quietly in her own private hour at the virginals, remains, even now, centuries after her death, a figure people continue to study, to paint, to write about, to wonder over, precisely because underneath all that careful, deliberate construction, something genuinely human persisted, something worth remembering long after the pearls and the paint themselves have turned, inevitably, to dust. What stays with me most, having spent this entire evening walking through her extraordinary day alongside you, is not actually the grandeur of it, the pearls or the audience with the ambassador or the elaborate poetry comparing her to goddesses and moons. It is the smaller, quieter details tucked in between all of that grandeur, the particular tiredness of a body held upright for 12 hours inside boning and heavy fabric, the small private embarrassment of being caught playing music for no audience but herself, the genuine grief carried quietly for a friend lost years earlier, a letter kept close among her most private possessions, the simple universal relief of finally, at the end of a long day, being permitted to lie down and stop performing entirely, if only for a few hours, if only within the narrow, carefully guarded privacy of a curtained bed. These are not the details history usually chooses to remember first about Elizabeth I. History remembers the Armada and the Golden Age, and the Virgin Queen who never married, the grand sweep of policy and war and succession that shaped an entire kingdom's future for generations to come. And all of that matters a great deal and remains genuinely worth knowing. But underneath it, every single day for over 4 decades lived an actual woman, waking tired, worrying over small domestic crises, loving sugar more than was good for her teeth, delighting in music and dogs and the particular pleasure of a well-danced evening, grieving losses that never fully left her, and closing each day, as we have watched her close this one, with the same small, quiet rituals that carry nearly every human being toward rest, regardless of century, regardless of crown. Whatever extraordinary things fill your own days, and whatever quietly ordinary things fill them too, I hope there is something in her story tonight that felt in some small way worth recognizing in your own life as well. The tiredness, the small private pleasures, the particular comfort of finally being allowed, at the end of a long day, to simply stop. There is one more detail about that careful white paint we described so early in tonight's story, one I held back deliberately until now, because I think it belongs here, in these final reflective minutes, more than it belonged back in the busy rush of the morning dressing itself. The cerise mixture applied to Elizabeth's face was often finished with a thin glaze of egg white, brushed lightly over the dried paint, to give it a smooth, almost porcelain sheen under candlelight, the particular glossy finish that made her complexion appear so strikingly flawless from across a crowded hall. But that same glaze came with a genuine cost. It cracked. Smiling too broadly, laughing, even speaking with much animation risked fracturing the smooth surface into tiny visible lines, and by several surviving accounts, Elizabeth's face in her final years bore exactly this kind of fine cracking by the end of a long day, the careful mask beginning, quite literally, to show its seams the longer she wore it. Attendants would have watched for this carefully, touching up small cracks where possible between audiences, aware that the illusion required constant, careful maintenance throughout every single hour it needed to hold. I keep returning to this image, honestly, sitting with it now in these final quiet minutes of tonight's story. A queen whose face, by the end of a long evening exactly like the one we have spent together tonight, had begun, ever so slightly, to crack, not dramatically, not visibly to most people watching from any real distance, but there, if you looked closely enough, if you were among the very small handful of people ever permitted close enough to actually see it, the mask, however carefully constructed, however skillfully maintained across 4 entire decades, remained, in the end, exactly what it always was, a mask, beautiful, formidable, genuinely effective at the work it was built to do, and underneath it, the whole time, an actual woman, tired by evening, her own true face waiting patiently beneath the paint for the quiet privacy of exactly this hour to finally, gently let it show again. Even the words used to address her carried their own small history worth knowing before we close tonight completely. The formal style of address we now consider almost automatic for English royalty, Your Majesty, became firmly established as the standard form specifically during Elizabeth's own reign, gradually displacing the somewhat less exalted Your Grace that had served earlier Tudor monarchs perfectly well. This was not simply a matter of changing fashion in language. It reflected a deliberate elevation of the monarchy's own claimed status, majesty carrying considerably grander, more sweeping connotations than grace ever had, another small thread in the same larger project of image and authority we have traced across nearly every hour of tonight's story. Courtiers addressing her directly learned an entire careful vocabulary of appropriate address, Your Majesty in formal contexts, occasionally softened to something warmer and more personal among her closest and most trusted attendants, though never so far as genuine familiarity, not even after decades of intimate daily service. The precise weight and formality of every single word spoken in her presence mattered, in this world, considerably more than we might casually assume, one more layer of the same careful architecture of hierarchy and distance that shaped nearly everything else we have discussed tonight, from the concentric rooms of the palace itself to the careful gradations of rank among her own ladies in waiting. I find something worth sitting with in this particular detail, honestly, the way even language itself, the simple words people used every single day to address the woman we have spent this entire evening following, had been shaped and elevated and carefully maintained specifically around her, specifically during her reign, one more small piece of evidence for just how thoroughly this entire world had organized itself around a careful, deliberate construction of exactly the image Elizabeth herself had spent decades working to build and protect. Christmas and the Twelfth Night celebrations that followed it brought their own particular flavor to this world, worth a brief mention here before we let tonight's story finally close. The full 12 days of Christmas were marked at court with an extended sequence of feasting, entertainment, and gift-giving considerably grander than the ordinary rhythm of court life we have spent most of tonight describing. Plays and masks performed across successive evenings, elaborate meals stretching the kitchens and their staff to genuine capacity, and the New Year gift ceremony we discussed earlier, arriving as the practical and political centerpiece of the entire festive season. Twelfth Night itself, marking the close of these festivities, traditionally featured its own particular inversions and games, a lord of misrule sometimes appointed in noble households to preside over an evening of deliberately topsy-turvy entertainment, though the more formal royal court under Elizabeth generally favoured considerably more controlled and dignified versions of these older folk traditions. Even so, the underlying spirit of the season, warmth, abundance, and genuine collective celebration after the shorter, colder days of deep winter ran clearly through however Elizabeth's own court chose to mark it. One more example of the genuine joy and pleasure that existed alongside all the careful calculation and political theatre we have spent tonight examining so closely. I like ending on this particular note. Honestly, this reminder that whatever the elaborate structure and careful performance surrounding nearly every hour of Elizabeth's public life, genuine warmth and genuine celebration found their place within it too, seasons turning, feasts arriving, music and laughter filling halls that could just as easily, on other nights, hold considerably more serious and weighty business. A full life, in other words, however extraordinary its particular circumstances, containing within it the same essential mixture of labour and rest, duty and pleasure, formality and genuine warmth that shapes nearly every human life, regardless of century, regardless of crown. We are nearing the end of tonight's story now, and I want to bring you gently back, one final time, to that quiet curtained bed where we have spent so much of this evening, because that is where we should properly leave her, and in a sense where we should properly leave you too. The night outside continues its slow, patient turning, the deepest hours giving way, eventually imperceptibly toward whatever comes next, though we will not follow that transition tonight. There is no need to watch her wake, to watch the whole extraordinary machinery of her public life stir itself back into motion, the candles relit, the water warmed, the wig retrieved from its wooden form, the paint mixed fresh, the pearls counted out once more from their locked case. That belongs to tomorrow, and tomorrow, for tonight's purposes, can simply wait. What matters right now is only this: a tired woman finally at rest, a room dark and warm and carefully guarded, a whole enormous palace breathing slowly around her, fires banked, linens soaking, guards patient at their posts, everything held gently in that particular suspended stillness that belongs to the deepest hours of any night, in any century, in any life. She sleeps now the way you are likely drifting towards sleep yourself, right now, wherever you happen to be lying tonight, the day's performance finally set aside, whatever weight the daylight hours ask you to carry finally permitted to rest alongside you rather than on top of you. I hope, if nothing else survives from tonight's long journey through pearls and paint and careful political theatre, that this particular image stays with you as you drift the rest of the way toward your own sleep. Not the Queen, not Gloriana, not the Virgin Queen, not the carefully painted symbol that an entire kingdom looked to for stability and strength across 4 remarkable decades. Just a tired woman, finally allowed to close her eyes in a warm dark room, surrounded by people who cared for her, however imperfectly, however shaped by duty and hierarchy and the strange particular demands of her extraordinary life. Remember, near the very beginning of tonight's story, when I told you she had likely gone several mornings without a full bath, relying instead on warm cloths and scented water and fresh linen changed carefully throughout the day. That small detail, which probably struck you as strange when we first mentioned it, makes a different kind of sense now, I think, having spent this entire evening walking through everything surrounding it. Nothing about Elizabeth's care was careless or neglectful. It was simply organized around an entirely different understanding of the body than the one we carry now, cautious rather than casual, considered rather than routine. Every single choice weighed against a whole framework of medical belief that shaped nearly every hour of her extraordinary life. And remember, too, the lead hidden inside that careful white paint, slowly working against the very beauty and vitality it was designed to project. There is something worth sitting with in that particular contradiction one final time before we let it rest completely. The tools this world used to project strength, timelessness, untouchable royal authority, carried within them, quietly, their own slow undoing, a pattern that repeats itself in different forms across nearly every century, including, if we are honest with ourselves, our own. She could not have known, sitting in that chair this morning while her women worked the mixture gently into her skin, precisely what we understand now about the substance she trusted so completely. None of us in any century ever fully know what our own careful daily rituals might quietly be costing us. We simply do the best we can with what our own particular world has taught us to believe, the way Elizabeth did, the way her physicians did, the way I suspect most of us are doing right now too, in whatever room you happen to be resting in tonight, trusting whatever careful rituals structure your own days, mostly without pausing to wonder what a listener 400 years from now might eventually come to understand about them. Before we close completely, I want to spare one final thought for all the hands we have mentioned only briefly across tonight's long story, the ones history barely names at all, the laundress still working somewhere below us by lantern light, the scullion scouring the last of tonight's pots before finally allowing himself a few hours of rest, the groom checking on horses that will need him again before the sun is properly up, the women of the privy chamber, whose names occasionally survive in household accounts and occasionally do not, who spent hours today lacing and painting and pinning and counting pearls, who will rise again tomorrow, likely before Elizabeth herself stirs, to begin readying everything this extraordinary day required all over again. Elizabeth's own remarkable life, the one we have spent tonight examining so closely, rested entirely on the accumulated labour of dozens, arguably hundreds, of people whose own stories we will likely never fully know, whose own tiredness at the end of a long day mattered just as genuinely as the Queen's, even if history recorded almost none of it. I think that is worth remembering honestly in these final quiet minutes, this reminder that even the most extraordinary life, the most carefully documented, most thoroughly painted and written about existence in an entire kingdom's history, depended completely on ordinary people doing ordinary, exhausting, largely unrecorded work, day after day, for decades on end. Wherever you are tonight, whatever quiet, unglamorous labour fills your own days, I hope you feel some small kinship with all of them too, not just with the Queen at the centre of tonight's story, but with everyone who kept her world turning, gently, patiently, one exhausted, faithful day at a time. There is one more small physical object worth describing before we finish tonight, because it appeared constantly throughout the working hours we spent with her earlier in this story, and it carries its own particular texture and weight worth imagining clearly. Her signature, Elizabeth Regina, appeared at the bottom of countless documents across every single year of her reign, written with a quill cut and trimmed by a dedicated attendant, dipped in ink mixed from gall nuts and iron salts, the same rich dark brown ink used across most formal correspondence of this entire era, drying slowly enough that a fine sand or powder was often sprinkled across a freshly signed document to help set it before the parchment could be folded or handled further. Beyond her signature, the Great Seal of England carried its own considerable ceremony, a large wax impression pressed onto or attached to documents requiring the fullest weight of royal authority, the wax itself heated carefully over a small flame. Before the seal, a heavy engraved metal matrix showing Elizabeth enthroned in full royal regalia was pressed firmly down to leave its detailed impression behind. Smaller signet rings, worn on her own hand, provided a more personal, more immediate form of authentication for less formal correspondence, a quick press of ring against warm wax substituting for the full ceremony the Great Seal required. I find something genuinely satisfying in imagining this particular texture. Honestly, the scratch of quill against parchment, the particular smell of gall ink and melted wax, the small physical weight of a signet ring pressed briefly into softened red or green wax before it cooled and hardened permanently into place. So much of what we have discussed tonight exists now only as description, as history retold second-hand across centuries. But documents like these, bearing her actual signature, her actual seal, still survive today in archives and collections, physical objects that her own hand and her own ring genuinely touched, one of the few truly direct, unmediated connections we still have to the actual woman herself, rather than the carefully constructed image she spent an entire lifetime building around her. Somewhere in the very last hour, before we finally let this story rest completely, I keep thinking about tomorrow, waiting quietly just beyond tonight's darkness, the way tomorrow always does. Before the sun has properly cleared the horizon, this entire palace will stir back to life, exactly as it has every single morning for as long as anyone currently living within these walls can remember. A groom will rise first, probably, tending to horses that need him regardless of the hour. Scullions will follow soon after, coaxing last night's banked coals back into proper flame, beginning the long, patient work of readying breakfast for a household numbering in the hundreds. And eventually, in her own quiet chamber, one of Elizabeth's women will wake too, perhaps before the Queen herself stirs, checking that the water is warming, that fresh linen waits ready, that today's chosen gown, already selected the evening before, remains exactly as it should be, prepared and waiting for the same elaborate, careful hour of construction we watched unfold together at the very beginning of tonight's story. The whole extraordinary cycle will begin again, the washing and the painting and the pinning and the pearls, hour after careful hour, building the queen the world expects to see out of the tired, human woman who slept, as she is sleeping right now, in this same curtained bed. But that is tomorrow's story, not tonight's. And tonight, at least, she is simply resting. Let her rest. Let the candle beside her bed burn down completely unnoticed into a small pool of spent wax. Let the guard outside her door complete his long, patient watch undisturbed. Let the whole enormous, breathing machinery of this palace continue its slow work quietly around her, exactly as it has tonight, exactly as it will again tomorrow night, and the night after that, for as many nights as still remain to her. Not every day in Elizabeth's world unfolded quite as smoothly as the one we have spent tonight following, and it feels honest to mention that before we close completely, because a life this heavily performed inevitably had its harder days too. Illness visited her more than once across these later years, occasional fevers or digestive troubles that kept her confined to her private chambers for days at a stretch, physicians hovering with real concern, council business briefly suspended or conducted through intermediaries while she recovered, the entire kingdom's business quietly paused around the simple, unavoidable fact of one woman's temporary frailty. On days like those, the elaborate morning ritual we described so carefully tonight would likely have been abandoned or considerably simplified. A plain shift and loose robe replacing the farthingale and the towering ruff, cosmetics left aside entirely in favour of simple rest, the wig set back on its wooden form, untouched for however many days the illness required. These were not days anyone at court spoke about openly, and they rarely appear in the grander histories written about her reign, but they happened, regularly enough, scattered quietly across 4 decades of otherwise remarkably sustained public performance. Bad weather, too, occasionally reshaped an ordinary day considerably, a sudden storm keeping her indoors rather than walking the gardens we described earlier. Entertainment moved from an open courtyard to a smaller indoor hall on short notice. Travel plans for a planned progress delayed by roads made impassable through days of steady rain. The elaborate, carefully choreographed world we have spent tonight exploring still answered, in the end, to weather and illness and all the other small, stubborn realities that no amount of royal authority could ever fully control. A reminder that even the most extraordinary life remained, underneath everything, genuinely subject to the same ordinary forces that shape every other life too. I want to spend a moment too on something we touched only briefly earlier, the specific texture of a domestic petition rather than a grand foreign audience, because it shows a rather different side of how Elizabeth's authority actually operated day to day. On many ordinary afternoons across her reign, considerably less glamorous than the ambassador's visit we spent time with tonight, a local dispute might be brought before her council for final resolution, a disagreement over land boundaries between two gentry families perhaps, or a widow petitioning for the restoration of some property she believed had been wrongly seized, matters that would never appear in any grand history of the era, but that mattered enormously to the individuals directly involved. Elizabeth's own direct involvement in matters this specific varied considerably depending on the case and the parties involved. Many such disputes handled entirely by her council or by the ordinary courts without ever requiring her personal attention at all. But cases involving petitioners of sufficient connection or disputes touching on some broader principle her council considered worth the Queen's own direct judgment occasionally did reach her, presented through the same careful chain of secretaries and councillors that managed the enormous flow of correspondence we discussed earlier tonight. A petitioner granted this kind of access, however brief, however carefully managed, would have understood themselves to be receiving something genuinely rare and valuable, an actual moment of direct royal attention in a system otherwise built almost entirely around layers of intermediary authority, standing between ordinary subjects and the monarch herself. I find something worth noticing in this particular contrast. Honestly, the same woman capable of commanding an entire foreign audience through calculated silence and practiced grace, also occasionally sitting with real attention through the considerably smaller, considerably more mundane concerns of a single anxious widow or a minor gentry dispute, understanding, perhaps, that even the smallest acts of visible royal justice help sustain the broader loyalty and legitimacy her entire extraordinary reign ultimately depended upon. There is a particular quality to candlelight in a room like the one we have spent so much of tonight inside, and I want to give it one final, unhurried moment of attention before we truly let this story rest, because it has been sitting quietly behind nearly every scene we have described tonight without ever receiving the full attention it deserves. Beeswax candles produce a warmer, steadier light than the cheaper tallow candles used elsewhere in the household, a soft golden glow considerably kinder to the eye than the harsher, smokier light tallow tends to throw, and it is this particular warm glow that has lit nearly every single scene we have walked through together this evening. The morning washing, the careful painting, the audience with the ambassador, the quiet hour at the virginals, and now, finally, this last, slow settling into sleep. Watch it for a moment if you can picture it clearly. The way it catches on the edge of a silver basin, or the smooth curve of a pearl, or the fine embroidered thread worked through a stomacher laid carefully aside for the night. The way it throws long, soft shadows across tapestried walls, shapes shifting gently whenever a draught moves through the room, whenever someone crosses quietly from one side of the chamber to the other, the way it eventually, inevitably, burns lower and lower, the flame growing smaller, the light growing dimmer, until finally, sometime in these deepest hours, it simply gutters out altogether, leaving the room in whatever darkness the night itself provides, moonlight or starlight or simply the deep, complete black of a heavily curtained chamber with no light left burning at all. That is where we are now, I think, in this final quiet stretch of tonight's story. The candle beside her bed has burnt down to almost nothing. The light in the room has softened to almost nothing. And somewhere within that soft, settling darkness, Elizabeth sleeps on, undisturbed, exactly as I hope you are drifting now too. Let me offer one more small, specific memory before we close, because it captures something warm and genuinely funny about her that deserves a place here, tucked into these final quiet minutes alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. Visitors to her court occasionally left behind small anecdotes describing Elizabeth's sharp, quick wit, her evident enjoyment of clever wordplay and pointed conversation, qualities that made her, by nearly every account, a genuinely engaging person to actually spend time with, whatever the formal weight of her position might suggest to us reading about her centuries later. She was known to tease favoured courtiers with real affection, to enjoy sharp verbal sparring with advisers confident enough to hold their own against her, and to reward genuine cleverness wherever she found it, with visible delight. There are accounts of her laughing openly at court entertainments, of trading quick, pointed remarks with foreign ambassadors that left translators working hard to capture the full flavour of what she had actually said, of a genuine, evident pleasure in language itself, in the careful, clever arrangement of words that connects directly back to the considerable scholarly education we discussed a little earlier tonight. I like closing on this particular note, honestly, this reminder of her genuine warmth and genuine humour, because it balances something that could otherwise feel, by the end of a story this long, rather heavier than I want to leave you with tonight. Yes, her life was carefully constructed, heavily performed, constantly watched, and genuinely difficult in ways we have spent considerable time examining tonight. But it was also, by every good account that survives her, a life containing real laughter, real cleverness, real warmth extended toward the people she trusted, a woman who could command a room through calculated silence and could just as easily fill that same room with genuine, delighted laughter, depending entirely on what the particular moment called for. Something else worth considering is the sheer number of languages moving through this palace on any given day, and it feels worth mentioning here before we close, because it adds another texture entirely to the world we have spent tonight exploring. English remained the primary language of the court, of course, but Latin still carried real weight in formal diplomatic and religious contexts. French served as a genuine common language for much of European diplomacy, and Elizabeth's own considerable skill in Italian and Spanish, alongside these others, gave her real advantages in negotiations where a foreign ambassador might otherwise have assumed the English Queen required a translator's careful mediation for every single exchange. There are accounts of her switching languages mid-conversation specifically to catch a foreign visitor off guard, addressing an ambassador suddenly and fluently in his own native tongue after minutes of formal exchange conducted through an interpreter, a small, deliberate demonstration of both her education and her command of the room, delivered with what several witnesses describe as visible, quiet satisfaction at the surprise it produced. Language itself, in other words, functioned as one more tool in her considerable arsenal, alongside the pearls and the careful silences and the calculated compliments we discussed earlier tonight. One more way of managing exactly how she was perceived by whoever happened to be standing in front of her in any given moment. This particular skill had been cultivated deliberately from childhood, her tutors selected specifically for their scholarly reputation, her education considerably more rigorous than most princesses of her era typically received, a fact that shaped in real and lasting ways the formidable political operator she eventually became. Whatever else this long evening together has taught us about pearls and paint and careful performance, I think this detail deserves its own quiet acknowledgement too, the genuine, hard-won intellectual achievement sitting underneath so much of what we have spent tonight describing. There is a small, particular ritual worth mentioning too, one we have not yet touched on tonight, concerning how her ladies actually cared for that famous red hair before it thinned enough to require the wigs we discussed earlier, because even in decline, the daily maintenance of what remained continued with real dedication, a mixture of herbs and oils, rosemary among the most commonly favoured across this era for exactly this purpose, would have been worked gently through whatever hair remained, believed to strengthen the roots and encourage what growth was still possible, applied with the same patient, practised care that governed nearly every other aspect of her daily maintenance. Combs of ivory or fine wood, carefully kept and cleaned, moved through her hair with real gentleness, an attendant's steady hands working slowly rather than hurriedly, aware that rough handling could accelerate exactly the thinning everyone in this room was quietly trying to manage and conceal. Small silk or linen caps sometimes protected her natural hair beneath the wig during the day, both practical padding for the hairpiece to sit against, and one more small, quiet layer of protection for hair already understood, by this point in her reign, to be considerably more fragile than it once had been. I find something genuinely tender in imagining this particular small ritual, honestly, tucked as it was somewhere within the larger, more elaborate morning routine we walked through so carefully at the start of tonight's story. Amid all the pearls and the painted mask and the towering ruff, this quieter moment persisted too, one woman gently tending to another woman's thinning hair, patient and unhurried, a small act of genuine care existing entirely outside the realm of political calculation or careful public performance, simply one person looking after another, the way people have always looked after each other, in palaces and cottages alike, across every single century history has ever bothered to record. Music followed her through this palace in ways considerably more constant than the single quiet hour at the virginals we described earlier tonight, and I think it deserves one final mention before we close, because it threaded through nearly every scene we have walked through together this evening without always announcing itself directly. A consort of musicians maintained on regular household salary provided music for meals, for formal entertainments, for the dancing we described earlier. Their instruments, viols and lutes and virginals and recorders, tuned and ready throughout nearly every waking hour of the court's collective day. Elizabeth's own patronage extended beyond simply enjoying music performed for her. She actively supported composers and musicians across her reign. Several of the finest composers working in England during this period, receiving royal favour and protection that allowed their own considerable talents to flourish. William Byrd, among the most significant composers of this entire era, held a position within the Chapel Royal for years, his sacred and secular compositions alike benefiting from exactly the kind of stable royal patronage that allowed genuinely ambitious musical work to be created, rehearsed, and performed at the level of craft this particular period in English music is still remembered for today. I think there is something worth appreciating in this final small thread. Honestly, this quiet, sustained cultural patronage running alongside everything else we have discussed tonight, the elaborate performance and the careful political calculation and the genuine private grief and the equally genuine private joy. A court capable of producing some of the finest music, finest poetry and finest drama of its entire era, flourishing specifically because a woman who loved these things herself, who played her own virginals with real private pleasure in whatever quiet hours her extraordinary life still allowed her, understood exactly how valuable that kind of genuine cultural flourishing could prove to be for her own reputation and for the kingdom she spent 4 remarkable decades so carefully, so completely governing. Books, too, filled whatever quiet corners of Elizabeth's life still remained available for genuinely private pleasure, and it feels right to mention them here in these final settling minutes, alongside music and language and everything else we have gathered about her genuine intellectual life tonight. Her own library, maintained across several of the royal residences we discussed earlier, held works of history, philosophy, theology, and classical literature, texts in Latin and Greek she could read directly without translation, evidence of an education that continued shaping her private habits of mind decades after her formal tutoring had ended. She is recorded reading for genuine pleasure in whatever private hours her schedule allowed, a habit that connects directly back to the translations she herself produced across her life. Careful, considered work undertaken not for any political necessity, but simply because she found real satisfaction in wrestling a difficult classical text into clear, elegant English prose. This particular pleasure, quiet and entirely private, existed almost entirely outside the realm of performance and political calculation that shaped so much of everything else we have discussed tonight. A genuine intellectual life pursued largely for its own sake, in whatever narrow margins her extraordinary public role still left available to her. I want to leave you with this particular image before we finally let this whole long evening rest completely, honestly. Somewhere among the pearls and the paint and the careful political theatre, a genuinely curious, genuinely engaged mind kept its own quiet, persistent company across every single one of these remarkable decades, reading, translating, thinking, finding real private satisfaction in exactly the kind of intellectual pleasure that required no audience at all, that asked nothing of her except the simple, genuine engagement of her own considerable mind with ideas she found worth wrestling with, for no reason beyond her own genuine wanting to. One final small ceremony belongs here before we truly close, a detail about the physical act of leaving the Queen's presence that reveals once more just how thoroughly formality governed even the smallest gestures of this world. Courtiers withdrawing from Elizabeth's company, whether from a formal audience or a considerably more casual conversation, were expected never to turn their backs on her directly, retreating instead with careful, measured backward steps until sufficient distance or a doorway allowed a proper, respectful turn away from her at last. This particular courtesy, small and easily overlooked, required real practice to perform smoothly, courtiers occasionally stumbling over furniture or one another in their careful effort to maintain it, especially in crowded rooms where backward movement carried genuine physical risk alongside its ceremonial weight. I mention this final tiny detail because it captures in miniature nearly everything we have spent this entire evening exploring together. Even the simple act of leaving a room, something every single person reading or listening to this story performs dozens of times a day without a moment's conscious thought, became in Elizabeth's world a small, careful performance governed by rules everyone present understood completely and observed without exception. Formality reached into every corner of this life, however small, however seemingly insignificant, right down to the precise manner in which a person was permitted to walk away from her. And yet, underneath every single one of these careful rules, the woman we have spent tonight following remained exactly what she always was: tired by evening, genuinely funny when the moment allowed it, capable of real grief and real tenderness and real, unguarded laughter, a formidable ruler and a genuinely curious mind, and, in these final quiet hours we have spent together tonight, simply a person, finally permitted to rest. You, listening now, wherever tonight has found you, deserve one last thought too. I hope something of this long, strange, genuinely human day has settled over you the way I intended it to, gently, the way a story should settle over someone drifting steadily toward their own rest. We have covered a great deal of ground together tonight, more than I think either of us quite expected when we first stepped quietly into that curtained bedchamber this morning, watching a tired woman wake into a day that would ask more of her in almost every conceivable way than most days ask of most people. We watched her transformed, piece by careful piece, from an ordinary aging body into something the entire watching world understood as timeless. We learnt about the lead hidden in her paint, the sugar that darkened her teeth, the trusted hands required even for her most private moments, the guards who never once left her fully alone, in any room, at any hour, across her entire reign. We wandered too through gardens and galleries, through council chambers and presence chambers, through the vast unseen labour of laundresses and scullions and grooms who kept this entire extraordinary world turning steadily, quietly, mostly unnoticed, beneath everything Elizabeth herself ever experienced directly. And we found, underneath all of it, an actual woman, sharp-minded and genuinely funny, prone to real anger and real tenderness in roughly equal measure, capable of commanding an entire kingdom's careful attention, and also capable of blushing quietly at being overheard playing music she loved. A woman who grieved a lost friend for the rest of her own life. A woman who danced with real joy well into years when court gossip whispered she was surely too old for such things. A woman who, despite every pearl and every carefully applied layer of paint, despite every guard and every trusted attendant standing constant watch around her, was still, in the end, simply a person, tired at the close of a long day, glad, whatever else the day had asked of her, to finally lie down and rest. That is where we leave her tonight, and honestly, I think it is exactly the right place to leave her, not mid-ceremony, not mid-audience, not frozen forever in the timeless, ageless mask her portraits still show us today, just resting, quietly, completely, the same way I hope you are resting now, or very nearly there. Let the dark hold you gently tonight, the way it held her. Let whatever weight today asked you to carry finally set itself down, the same way her pearls and her painted composure were carefully set aside, hours ago now, in that quiet chamber we have spent this whole evening imagining together. Let your own breathing slow, the way hers slowed, into something steady and unhurried and entirely unconcerned, for now, with whatever tomorrow happens to hold. Sleep well, love. Truly, whatever your own crown looks like, whatever your own careful daily performance requires of you, you have earned this rest every bit as genuinely as any queen ever did, 400 years ago or tonight. Let it come for you now, slowly, gently, completely, the the way it finally, quietly came for her. Rest now, truly, completely, exactly as she finally did.